break it down into small chunks. Figure out which chunk you can do, and then do that chunk, and then come back and try again. Figure out a new chunk to do and do that. By the time you've eliminated all the chunks that you can do, the problem should be fairly small. Let's take a look at our form. As you can see, there's a lot going on in this form. And especially if you're a newer C# developer, I'm sure this can be a bit overwhelming. We have 4 buttons, 2 lists, and a bunch of tables behind the scenes that we need to use to support this form. But if we look at this in chunks, we can see there's an Add New Member section that's practically a separate form. And it looks and it operates just like the prize form. And that makes it a very clear chunk that we can do. And since it isn't really tied to anything else in this form until the very end, after we've created the new member, let's start there. Now the first thing to point out is that the Add New Member is actually adding a new person. We come to the database and look at the people table and do the design view. We have first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number. When we talk about a team member, all we're really talking about is the person ID and the team ID. So this is more an add person. But in the form, it makes sense to call it Add New Member since we're talking about team members. So with that in mind, let's create the event for this button. Now there's a couple different ways you can create events. If you want the default event, which we do, you can double click on the button and that will create the event in the code. Or you can go to Properties, go to this lightning bolt up here. We click on that and find the event we want and either do a drop down and select an already created event for us, or we double click in this area in the gray space, the white space, whatever the color is that your background is. If you double click here, it will create that event as well. And you can do that in any one of your events. Now we're doing a default event, so I can just double click right here and it creates that event for us. Now this comes back to naming. We worked hard to make sure that everything was named properly. And we did that up front because when you start creating events, this created the Create Member button _click event. Well, that's tied to the Create Member button. But if I had called this button 1, then this would be button 1 _click. If I come back over here and change this to the Create Member button, this event will not change its name. We'd have to go in and manually change that name. And that's just a pain. So my suggestion is get your naming done first. The first thing you do right out of the gate so you're sure that your naming's locked in before you start creating events. Now in this event, essentially what we want to do is we want to take the 4 fields here, create a person model out of them, and then save that to either the database or the text file. So just like, let's go over and look real quick at the prize form code. We validate the form, create a prize model, save that prize model, and then clear out the form. So that's essentially what we're going to do again in this one. So the first step is to validate this form. And what validation do we want to have on this form? Well, we can just create a method do we call it isValid? Let's check it out real quick. It's usually good to keep, now we call it validate form. It's usually good to keep the same naming convention so you just know what to expect. When I see validate form, I know it's going to do a certain task. And really here, we could do something very, very simple, or even if we said, you know, at this point we're not going to put validation in, we could say to do add validation to the form and then just return true. Because now we can use this and it will work every time and it's not going to validate anything yet, but later we can come back and say, okay, now I want to put validation in. I go to do right here, and I actually do validation and return true or false. And so that's a way to kind of bypass the work of validation now and come back and do it later, or come back later and say, I want to up the validation, make it more impressive, more, more robust. For example, for right now, we're just going to say these 4 fields have to have a value. For email address, we could actually validate it to make sure that it has the @ symbol, and that something's before that @ symbol, and there's something after that @ symbol, and there's a dot in there somewhere for, so it'd be tim@iamtimcorey.com. So we can validate certain things, or we can get really robust and say, okay, there's certain special characters it shouldn't have, and all the rest to validate just the email address. Same as cell phone number. We could get really specific on, especially if we're expecting US, we could say, okay, a US phone number has 11 numbers maximum. That would be the country code, the area code, and a 7-digit phone number. Now it doesn't account for extensions, but we're saying it's a cell phone number, not a business line. And we can do all those validations, but for right now, I'm just going to validate first name, last name, email, and cell phone all have some type of string in there. So if first name value dot text dot length equals 0, return false. Okay, so I've got this first check here. I'll actually copy this. Now I'll paste it in and change this from first name value to last name value. And then once again for email address and cell phone number. Oops. Cell phone value dot text dot length. So dot text dot length, what it does, it says here's the number. The length says here's the number of characters in this property, which is the actual value, whatever's inside of this box. And so it's going to say, is it equal to 0? If it is, return false. So we're going to say if validate form. So if that's true, it's a valid form, therefore we do something. We can also have our else here and say just our message box dot show and say you need to fill in all the fields. We can leave it like that. But if it's valid, then what we need to do is create a person model. We have to do control dot, add the using statement for tracker library.models. And we'll call this P equals new person model. P dot first name equals first name value dot text. P dot last name equals last name value dot text. P dot email address equals email value dot text. And finally, P dot cell phone number equals cell phone value dot text. Once we're done all of that, then we have to send this off to be created. We have the model. Now we actually save this to our database or text file. And if you ever get lost as to where you are, since we've already done this once, you can come back over here to the code for our create prize form, validate form, create the model. Now we go to globalconfig.connection.create prize. Only instead of create prize, we're going to say global connection, right? Nope, that's not right. Global config. There we go. I'm going to copy that and paste that so I make sure I type it right. Add the using statement for tracker library. Global config dot connection dot, and we have just create prize. We don't want to create a prize. We want to create a person. And pass in our model. So how do we do that? Well, we have to come up here and first look at our iData connection. We have the prize model create prize, passing the prize model. In the same way, person model create person, person model model. So that creates a new entry in our interface. Now that's going to break all of our current classes that implement iData connection, which is actually a good thing. Because that'll remind us, we need to implement the solution or the contract for this iData connector or connection. And so in this case, we have to add the create person method. We come over to text connection, and the same thing happens. It kicks in and says, oh, nope, you can't do that. We have to hit control dot. That little light bulb there kind of goes away. It's hard to track down. Half the time I get it, half the time I don't. And so I have to control dot and hit enter for the top one. In this case, we have now the create person for the text file. So we'll come back to the text file. Let's start with the SQL file. And the SQL file is going to do exactly the same thing as this one does, only with different values. I could copy this. Now, I said before that copy and paste is dangerous, and it really is. So if you're not absolutely sure you can go step by step and replace these things, don't do this. Actually type it out. It's up to you. For this video, it's much more convenient for me to copy and paste than it is to go ahead and type all this back out. All right, so now I've got to fill in my parameters. Well, I don't have place number. The first thing I have is first name, and I have last name. I have email address and cell phone. So those are 4 fields I have. I will probably name these the same. Now again, right now I'm guessing because I haven't actually created this insert store procedure yet. It'll be SP people insert. Now the other thing I don't have is that model.id. If you notice in the prize model, I have this ID. I'm actually going to copy the whole thing. The person model, we haven't created that ID yet. Remember, we didn't actually put our IDs in yet in our models. We left that off accidentally. And so we have to create those IDs because we need to know what those are. All right, so we have an ID now. So now we can actually pull the ID back out and return the model. And really everything here is wired up the way it should be. We're connecting to the tournaments connection string. We're creating our dynamic parameter list, which just happens to be the same, or the 5 parameters. They're different parameters, but it's still 5. The first 4 are first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number. And the last one is our ID, which gets passed the other direction. And so we pull that ID back out. It's called ID. We put that into our model and return the model. So let's take this and go over to our store procedures here and say new store procedure. We can get rid of all this top stuff. Create procedure. What's the procedure name? Well, it's actually dbo.sp people underscore insert. What are the parameters? At first name, and that's going to be of type. Let's look at the columns here. That's of type nvarchar100. At last name, nvarchar100. At email address, nvarchar100. And at cell phone number, varchar20. So be careful on that we get the types right, nvarchar versus varchar, and the number correct. So we can limit to the same limit as the table does. And if you get lost here, I do have a course on SQL that is very helpful for C# developers because it kind of gives you a good introduction all the way through actually building real databases that actually work and are a little more complex than just a starter tutorial, but more real world in how they're built. And so that really gives you a good foundation to work with SQL databases. All right, so at ID int output. Let's say equals 0 output. I said equals 0 because we may not even pass in this variable. Now we will, but if someone wanted to call this without passing it in because they don't have it yet, that's fine. We'll default it to 0. Now we can take this out and we can say insert into dbo.people, and that'd be first name, last name, email address, cell phone, and that's it. Values at first name, at last name, at email address, and at cell phone number. And then finally we need to say select at ID equals scope identity. Remember that pulls in the ID of the last created item or identity field in this scope, which is scope is this procedure. So that's our insert here. It'll grab the ID and pass it into the ID variable. And that's going to go the other direction. So if we execute this, we're good to go there. We can actually refresh our list. Make sure it shows up in the list. And it does. Right there. So now we should have an implemented SQL database save for our person. And now if we come back to our, not the prize form, the create team form, we can say P equals and pass it back in. But since we're not actually going to use that anywhere, let's not create a new variable unnecessarily or overwrite that variable unnecessarily. And the reason we're not using that yet is because this is only part 1 of this form. We're just creating the new member. And really we're dropping it off at that point. We're done. We're not putting it in this list yet. We're not putting it in this list yet. We're just done. And that's because this right here, this add new member section, is one chunk. We're going to do that chunk and then move on. Not try to do 3 or 4 or 5 at once, because that's where the issues slip in, where you start forgetting about sections like, oops, I didn't implement the text connector. So back over here, the last thing this form needs to do is actually clear out first name value dot text equals empty string, last name value dot text equals empty string, email value dot text equals empty string, and cell phone value dot text equals empty string. All right, so that clears that form out. And now we have created a new member when you say create new member. Now, we've just done a SQL connection, but let's test it to make sure it works. And I'm big on testing before you move on. So if you can get a little bit done and test it, that's great. Do that. So in order to do that, we have to come back here to Program and change our database type back to SQL. We had changed that before to test our text connector for the prize form. Now we're coming back to test our SQL connector for the create team form. All right, and we're going to test right here. The other thing we need to change back over here is we are running the create prize form, but we're not testing that anymore. Instead, we want to test the create team form. So let's change that in our startup. And now we can run this. We get it started here. Okay, I also want to open up SQL here, and I'll close this out, the procedure. And instead, I'm going to open up a new query window and just say select star from dbo.people. And we have nothing in the list. That'll be important to know for when we actually create somebody. All right, we're going to say Tim Corey, Tim at imtimcorey.com. The cell phone number is 111-555-1212, as in, no, I'm not giving that out. Create member. It blanks this out, which means something happened. If we run this query, we now have Tim Corey, Tim at imtimcorey.com, and 111-555-1212. Don't forget that right now we're not validating this, so it just goes in however we put it in. But SQL works. So that was really quick. That didn't take much time at all to implement this form. And part of the reason why is because we've done this before, and so we know what to expect and know the pattern to use, and so it kind of gets a lot easier. It's a lot easier than it was the last time when we had to figure out how to create the interfaces and how to set things up and so on and so forth, where this one we just say, use the same system we already set up. As you grow and develop as a C# developer, you'll have some of these things in your library, your personal library, where whether it's a formal library you have set up or just the patterns that you remember doing, you'll have these things to refer back to. It makes your job easier and easier, which is why it seems like senior level developers just fly through code. It's not really that they're flying through the code as much as it is they're just re-implementing the ideas they've already had. And they get some new and different ways, and they get some, a little twist on things here and there, but they're just solving the little areas that are complex, and the big areas that are just kind of generic, they're reusing patterns from their previous development career. So that's just something to keep in mind, that as you get more and more experience, this becomes easier and easier. And that's just my encouragement to you to always be practicing. The more you practice, the more you push yourself, the easier and easier these patterns become, where you can just re-implement it quickly. Okay, enough of the soapbox. Let's move on to implementing the text connector. So before I leave this, I'm going to switch this back to text just so we have it ready for ourselves. So I can close this out. And now I'm going to open up my text connector and essentially do the same thing as this, only up here for the create person. And the very first thing I need is this file up here, the file name. So private const string, and this would be the person model, or people, people file equals, we can call this either person models.csv, or you could call it people models.csv. I'm going to call it person models to fit in with the prize models, because see, this lines up pretty neatly. Prize models store prize models. So therefore, person model goes into person models. Now, you know, the casing here, the singular versus plural, you can figure that out for yourself. Naming's hard. Figure out what you want to do. My encouragement to you is always keep the same pattern going. In this case, I'm going to call it plural here, and then I'm going to call it the name of the model, and then pluralize that for the file name. Okay, so that's really minor, but that's up to you how you want to do it. So the first thing I want to do is say, just following the same pattern here, I want a list of person model called people equals, I'll even call it people file dot full file path, and that works the same way, dot load file dot convert to person models. Now we don't have a convert to person models yet. So we need to create that. Where do we create that? I'm going to copy that. We create that in the text connector processor. And that's right here. Convert to prize models. Well, down below it, we're going to have the public static list of person model. Convert to person models. This list of string lines. And this really is essentially the same thing as above. So it's going to be a list of person model. We're going to call this output equals new list of person model for each string line in lines. Now at some point you're probably thinking, wait a minute, you preach dry, the don't repeat yourself acronym. And how is this not repeating yourself? Because I'm essentially copying from up here down to here. And yes, it really is pretty close. The difference is it's not the same. We're using different models, and we'll use the different mappings down here. So it is different. With that being said, there is a way you could create one method that does any different type. It would be kind of complex, and I would encourage you, if you want to go down that road, instead of rewriting all that code, and it's really could be kind of complex, instead think about looking into a library called AutoMapper. AutoMapper will do a lot of this mapping for you from one type to another, or from even this, this list of string here. It can map that out into something different, like a list of prize model. So there's ways you can map it, and I'd encourage you to look at AutoMapper if you want to go that direction. But I will tell you this would get a little complex. And the reason it gets complex is because we're not mapping a string to a string most of the time. Most of the time, we have other values as well, like decimal and double and int. These all need parsed. These need to be parsed properly. And you need to handle the idea of error handling, which we haven't done yet. But the idea of what do you do when those things blow up? And all that work needs to be somewhere. And it's different for every column. Therefore, it's kind of complex. Therefore, the easiest way to do this is to spell out your mapping in a method, and then have a method for every single different type of model. Yes, it's a lot of code, but sometimes you have to write a lot of code. All right. So I'm going to start writing code. String array calls equals line dot split single quotes with a comma inside, and that splits our our line, which is one record, it splits it up by commas. Therefore, we can have it comma delimited. The key here, though, to note is we're splitting on commas if you have commas in your data. That could be a problem, because with commas in your data, then you're adding extra columns essentially and putting the wrong data in the wrong columns. And that's a problem. Now you can wrap your strings inside of quotes, and that won't happen then if you're careful, but this split will still split on that, since the split is really just a really basic splitter. It's not the more complex CSV processors that are out there. The quotes will help with opening Excel and those type of things. The quotes won't help you here unless you do a little more processing in this code. So just note that the cheap way, the easy way to fix that, if you do want to have commas, is to use a different character to split on. Instead of comma, it could be any character. So you could even have, something weird like the pipe command, the pipe key, that. You could use that. You could use the hashtag. You could use the @ symbol, which wouldn't work really well because you probably have email addresses and that uses the @ symbol. So you have to think things through, but you could also split. There's an overload of split. If you do the Control-Shift-Space in here, we are using the char separator, but we could also do down here the string separator, which is the double quotes. With a string separator, we could actually separate on more than one character. So that looked like this, the double quotes. Inside here, we could say, double pipe or triple pipe, or we could have, something even weirder like maybe it's pipe and then the caret and then pipe. And if you have that in your text, you're going to have problems anyways. So you could do something complex like that if you want to split in order to get around the idea of having commas in your data, or possibly have commas in your data. But in our case, I'm going to assume, at least for now, that we have no commas in our data. If we find there are commas, I'll either change this right here to something else, or I'll take those commas out in the validation process. Okay, so now we need to create our person model. We'll call it P. We're going to start adding to it. So P dot first name equals calls 0. Remember, ordering is now important. Calls 1. P dot email address. I'm using the same order I've used over and over again. Notice since they're strings, it's really easy. There's no parsing to do. All right, so there's the 4 lines. And then I can just say output dot add P. And I forgot one. And it's going to change the order, which is a problem. Did you catch the one I missed? P.id equals calls 0. And that's going to yell at me because I need to have int.parse calls 0. And again, that parse will blow up and crash our application since it's an unhandled exception if we pass in a non-number string. Okay, so we've created our person model. We have added the 5 values to the 5 properties. And then we've taken that and added it to our output list. And so the last thing is return output. So we can save that. We can come back to our text connector and pick up where we left off, which was we were just creating this final piece here so that now we have our people which is a list of person model. That people has now been created. And what this line has done is it has taken our file name, personmodels.csv, converted that to full path using our app.config. It's loaded that file, making sure it exists. And if it doesn't exist, it returns back an empty list. But it takes that list, if there is a list of the empty list, and it converts it to a list of person model. Again, if it's an empty list, we get an empty list of person model. Otherwise, we get a list of all the people in our CSV file. Next, we're going to need to find the max ID. In current ID, we're going to start off, initialize it at 1. Remember down here we said that we start off, the current ID is going to be the max ID plus 1. So if we can't find any records, then we're going to leave it at the default, which is 1, which is what we want to start the first ID at. So if people.count is greater than 0, the current ID equals people.order by descending x arrow x.id. So that's going to order this people list descending by ID. Take the first one, take its ID, add 1 to it, and that's the value of the current ID. Then we're going to take our model, the one passed in to create person, model.id equals current ID. Then we'll take that, say people.add our model. So whatever we have on our list, whether it's an empty list or a list of 5 or 10 or whatever, people, we're going to add our new person that we want to create into that list. Just what we did down here. And then we're going to say people.save to people file. And take the people file and pass that in. We don't have that method yet. What is the people file? Well, just like the save to prize file, we're going to create a save to people file. And that again is over here in the text connector. It's the text connector helper or the processor. Save to prize file, well, we're going to public static void save to people file. This list of people or person model, models, string file name. Now, let's comment this out for a minute. I just want to show you something. Over here in our overload, and give it a second to refresh, this is going to have a red squiggly under it saying I can't find this. But if we look on our Control J list, if we look under the S's, it hasn't updated yet to say no, there isn't a save to prize file. Oops, I'm in the wrong spot. That's why. All right, there we go. Save to people file. It's not there. If I hit Control J and look for my even save to prize file, the method we created before that we're already using and down below what we're using, I don't find it. Why is that? Well, because the extension method for save to prize file is on a list of prize model. Over here we have a list of person model, not prize model. Therefore, it's not even going to find this extension method. It will find this one though. All right, we're going to have a list of string lines equals new list of string. For each, we're going to say person model p in models. We're going to say lines.add. We're going to do our $sign syntax. And I'll finish it off with a semicolon so it can be complete. And then inside the double quotes, we're going to say p.id, comma, remember no spaces here, p.first name, and order is important. Oops, no space. p.last name, p.email address, p.cell phone number. And what's that doing? It's creating one string that is the ID, comma, the first name, comma, the last name, comma, the email address, comma, the cell phone number. And that's the same order as ID, first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number. There's our columns. And there's the columns laid out. So that's going to loop through our list of person model, our models. For each one, it's going to add that entry to our lines string. And then finally, we have the file.write all lines, file name dot full file path, oops, file name dot full file path, and lines, just like up here. Could have copied and pasted. What this does is it writes all the lines we're going to pass in. That's these. Where does it write it to? This file name, but the file name is not good enough. We need the full file path, including that name, which is what this extension method does for us. With that being said, we can save that, come back over here. This is now working properly, at least it should be. The last step we need to do is return model. Why? Well, we have created our list of the existing people. We've found the max ID and add 1 to it, or given a 1 if we don't have any people. And we've taken that and put it in as our model's ID number. Now it has an ID number. We have saved this model along with all the rest of our models, if any, back to our text file. And now we're passing back the original model it got passed in, only this time it has an ID associated with it. Okay, that's it. So now let's start this up. I can pull this over. I'll also pull over our folder. Notice our folder has the prize models.csv file, but not our person models. So let's add Joe Smith, Joey at smithy.com. Let's just do a 555-1234. Not a great phone number. It doesn't have the area code or country code. That's okay. Create member. And now we have a person model.csv. I can open that with Notepad. Pull that over and it says 1 Joe Smith, Joey at smithy.com, and our phone number. Just to make sure that it still works, if we do another one, let's do Sue Storm, Sue at stormy.net, and a cell phone number is that. We'll create the member, and we'll look at this file again. And now we have ID number of 2, which means we are incrementing our ID, and all the values are still there. So that's great. We are now saving to our text file as well as to our SQL file. And with that, we have implemented this little section here. Welcome to lesson 13 in the C# from start to finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to continue to work on our create team form. In our last video, we wired up the add new member section of our form. In this video, we're going to wire up our dropdown and our list box, as well as taking the add new member section, taking that object we created, that new person, and adding them to our list box as well. So that's the plan for this video. Now let's get started. Over here we have our form. Here's our dropdown, and here is our list box. Now, if you see my previous videos where I've wired up forms before, you know that behind this combo box and behind this list box, I'll have a list of, in this case, list of person. And for each of these, it's going to be a list of person. So let's go ahead and create those. This is my code behind. I hit F7. You can also come down here, right click on your create team form and say view code. That works as well. Now, at the class level, not inside of my constructor or inside any of my methods, I'm going to create a private list of person and call this available team members. Equals new list of person, private list, it's actually person model, but person's fine. Selected team members equals new list of person model. So what's going to happen over here is we'll have all the people that are available that could be on this team in this dropdown. We're going to select one, hit add member, and they come over here into this list box. Now, if you decide I want to add a new team member directly, you can create the new person, that'll create them, and then take that object and put it directly into this list. The next time we open up this form, that newly created person will now be in this dropdown. One other thing to note is you might be thinking, well, I could limit this so that the second team I create doesn't have those team members available to it. So this combo box can get smaller and smaller. And you could probably, maybe, kind of. The problem with that is this create team form is not directly tied to a tournament. Now, in our system, a tournament kicks off this form, but let's think this thing through. We can have more than one tournament going on at a time. So if we had a basketball tournament and a ping pong tournament, wouldn't I be available to be on a team for both? Therefore, be on two different teams. So it would get really complex to try and figure out how to limit this combo box to only people who are available to be on a team. Let's think worst case scenario for a minute. What if you had a ping pong doubles tournament? And so you had 2 people per team. And in the office, you have 7 people. Well, ideal would be 8. So maybe one person does double duty and it's on 2 different teams. That's a possibility. So instead of trying to do all this crazy logic to limit this combo box, we're going to leave it alone. The only limiting we'll do is if we have added a person to this list, they won't be in this dropdown. That's the only limitation we'll do, which actually makes our job easier. Okay, so we have these 2 lists. The available will go over here, and the selected will go over here. So that's our 2 lists. Now let's create a method that wires these lists up. So I'm going to create a method called private void wire up lists. And what this will do is it will wire up our dropdown or combo box and our list box to our list. So we can say, let's get the name of the dropdown. The dropdown is, here's the properties. It's select team member dropdown. Select team member dropdown dot data source equals available team member. Now we didn't used to be able to do this. We used to have to create a binding source between our dropdown and our list because the dropdown didn't know how to deal with a list directly. We don't anymore, which is great. That makes life a little easier. The other thing we need to do is look at our display member. Now our display member is a string, but that string represents one property inside of your, in this case, person model. So let's look at the person model and see which property do you want to pull over that represents the person. And I don't see one. I mean, we have first name, that's great until you have 2 Tims. Then it's a problem. And last name is great except when you have 2 Smiths. We could do email address, but do we all know each other's email addresses? It doesn't make sense. So let's create a new property that's a read-only property that uses the values from more than one of these properties. Now you could do the prop full and then just delete the stuff you don't want. You can delete that, you can change that to a string, change this, delete this, and then modify this. You could do that. Or you can just type it out. It's up to you. I'm going to type it out just so you can see it. Public string. I call this full name. And it just needs a get. All right, this get needs to return $, double quotes, semicolon, inside semiquote, or the double quotes. We'll do first name, then a space, then more curly braces, last name. Now we could return last name, comma, first name if you wanted to. If so, I'd probably call this full name reversed or full name last first. You know, some way of indicating that it's the full name, but it's got the last name first. But I think we're fine with doing the full name as it is. So I'm going to copy this. Normally we don't copy and paste very much inside of code because that's where your bugs come in, when you copy and paste and forget to change all the different areas that need to change. But in this case, I really highly recommend it because we have to put this name inside of double quotes. And that means there's no IntelliSense. There's nothing saying that's not right or that is right. Even if I typed this wrong, it wouldn't tell me that until runtime. And in fact, runtime, it wouldn't really tell me that. It would just give me a weird value in my list box or comma box. So I copy and paste there. So that's our select team member dropdown. And then we have this team members list box. So team members list box dot data source equals selected team members, and then the team member list box dot display member is going to equal full name as well. And again, I'm going to paste that in there. So both will have full name. Now let's call this inside of our constructor. There we go. And before we go any further, I'm actually going to create one more method. Private void create sample data. And what I do with this is I create a sample couple of records that I then add to my different lists. That way I can make sure the lists are working the way they're supposed to. So let's say available team members.add new person model, curly braces. I'll put my semicolon at the end first and come back and say first name equals Tim, last name equals Corey. Now I don't need to fill in the other fields because this is sample data and I'm only displaying just the first and last name. All right. And now I'll also do selected team members dot add new person model. Same thing, put our curly braces, put the semicolon at the end, come back. I'll copy that and paste it again, and Jones. There we go. And I'll put this method before the wire up lists in my constructor. So I'm going to add 2 records to each of my lists, and then wire up a list to the data sources of the dropdown and the list box. Why is that important? Well, if we start this, once it starts, you'll see that I have sample data in both lists. Here's the dropdown with Tim Corey and Sue Storm, and here is the list box with Jane Smith and Bill Jones. So both are working as they should, and now we can start working on putting actual data in here and then moving data around once we start wiring up these add member button, delete selected, and even tap into what this button is doing. So that works. So now I can actually get rid of the create sample data just by commenting it out. And the reason I do that is because I might want to come back later and put that in for testing purposes. And it really is a matter of uncomment, and that's it. The great thing about the compiler is if I were to send this code to production, this create sample data is never used, and it will not really do anything to my application to make it run slow or anything like that. It's just kind of there. So now let's wire up actual data collection here, or at least data display from our database or our text file. And how do we do that? Well, we need to come over here to our iData connector. And in here, I'm going to create a new rule or a new item in our contract. I'm going to say it's going to be a list of person model. I'm going to call this get person underscore all. That sounds a little bit weird, but what I'm saying is I want to get, not people, I'm going to say get person because that's the model, the person model over here. Get person all, just like create person. So my schema or my naming convention is going to be create for any kind of insert statement, get for any type of select statement where I'm getting records back. Now I don't need to pass anything in because we're getting all the people, and therefore that's all we need for our contract. Now let's come over to SQL and say, well, you're not currently implementing, so control dot, implement the interface. We can scroll down here and see that we have this right here. So now we can say using IDB connection equals new system.data.sql client.sql connection global config.cnn string tournaments. I'll put one more at the end of that. We hit enter, and now inside here we can actually call our store procedure, which is over here. We have it already created. It's the people get all. So if I run this, oops, dbo.sp people get all. And right now we have one person in our database. That's Tim Corey, and that's from our previous example where we were writing to SQL to test to make sure that the form worked. So that's all the people we have, and that's okay. We're going to call this stored procedure. Now before I call that, I'm actually going to create an output variable, a list of person model output. I'm not going to initialize it. Instead, I'll say output equals connection.query. This will be a person model. And then I will say, here is the store procedure. And that's really it. Dot to list. That converts it to a list from IEnumerable. And then at the very bottom here, we can return output. Now, you may be looking at that and saying, I can make this simpler. Take away this, and take away this, and just say here, return. Return this call. And yes, that is true, that is simpler, but here's the caveat to this. If I have any kind of issue where I want to debug, catching this before it returns the value can be tricky, especially if you have just a return statement here. Now, with this way, I could put my breakpoint right here, right after this is loaded, and then inspect this variable. It makes it a little easier for debugging. So I'm going to leave it that way so I have it in place for debugging. After I'm kind of comfortable with it, I might return it back to just a return, but I probably won't, because down the road, when I need to debug something, I don't want to have to rewrite code in order to debug. So I'll probably leave it that way. And that's something you're going to need to think through on your own. Is this way I'm going to do it or not? And that's really up to you. Okay, so we have this list of persons getting returned when we call the getPerson_all. And just so we don't have any problems here with compile time, I'm going to do my control dot and implement the interface, but notice it has that throw new not implemented exception, which is great because I don't want to implement it yet. One other thing to note is now that I've started to fill this in and I have more items in here, I'm starting to notice a repetition. This magic string tournaments. I'll want to fix that, and so let's actually just do that here. All right, so let's call it DB. And now I can replace all of these instances where it says tournaments with that string constant. And that way, if I ever need to change it, I change it here, and it changes for everything, not just one location. So if you're repeating yourself, figure out if you can do something different to make that a little easier or a little better. Okay, so we can come back over to our form here. And now instead of create sample data, I'm going to have a method that says private void load list data. And here, I'm going to start by calling the global config dot connection dot, and then right down here we have getPerson_all. And I will put this in the available team members. Now I could put this directly in here, and I might do that. It seems like it's a waste to create this method to do what's already been done, and it's also kind of a waste to have an initialization that then gets overwritten by this. So let's do that. Let's make it a little cleaner and do it just like that. So that's the available team members list. We can get rid of this. And notice nothing happens to the selected team members. And that's intentional because we don't need to change anything in that list. It should be empty to start with. We don't have anyone in the team to start with. Now if we run this form just as it is, let's make sure that we are in fact running from SQL. We're not. So let's change that to SQL. And now we can run it. And now if you notice, we have just Tim Corey as the selected team member, or all the team members in this list consist of just me. If we wanted to, we could add a new person, but it won't add anywhere yet. And instead of doing that now, let's do that once we've wired up where this goes. But first, I want to wire up what happens when we hit the Add Member button. We want to take the person from this list, remove them from this list, add them to this list, and then refresh both. So let's create our event for our button. I'll just double click this time. And there's our button event. And so the button event's job is going to be to take the person out of this list, put them into this list, and then refresh. So how do we know who's in that first list? Well, we're going to say person model P equals select team member dropdown dot selected item. Now that won't work until we cast it. We have to cast it to person model. And essentially what we're saying here is this normally is an object. If you notice, it says object right here for the type, but we said, no, it's not an object. We know that, well, everything's a base object, but this is more specifically a person model. Now, what'll happen is C# will say, okay, I'll trust you. And I will say, yes, this is a person model. And we'll take the selected item and try and shoehorn it into a person model variable. If it works, that's great. If it doesn't, it will blow up. But since we were the ones that filled in this dropdown with a list of person model, we know that's correct. So we're okay in this case. Now that we know who's been selected, we can say available team members dot remove, and that takes in a person model. It's going to find that person and remove them from the available team members list. That's P. Selected team members, it's not selected. Our list is, selected team members. So selected team members dot add P. So I've taken this person, I've found out who they are, what the actual person object is. I've removed them from the available team members list, and I've added them to the selected team members list. Now remember the way object instances work. We're not making copies here. We have taken the blueprint of the person model class and we've created a house. And we've said, okay, here is this house. It's at 123 Sesame Street. And so when I say find which one is selected, it's essentially saying the house at 123 Sesame Street has been selected. So when I say remove the object at 123 Sesame Street from this list, it says, okay, that does not destroy the house. It doesn't bulldoze the house. It just takes that address out of our address list. And conversely, we add that address to this address list. So we aren't making copies here. We're just moving who has that address around. In this case, we now have it removed from one and added to the other. I'm actually going to call the wire up lists method again. And now let's come through and do that same thing. It'll reset the data sources. That way they've been refreshed. And one of the benefits here is I can actually have a limited list, meaning a list is ordered by or has a where clause in it, something like that, then I have my data source list. And so what I can do is I can actually do that limitation here. And every time any kind of data changes, like down here, it'll refresh that list. Now let's see this in action. We can only do it once, but that's okay. We have Tim Core in the list. We hit add member. Nothing seems to happen. And so let's find out why. That's a great opportunity for us to debug when something we think should happen doesn't happen. What do we do? And so let's come down here and put our breakpoint in our event. I'm going to say add member. And it's going to say get the selected item. I'm going to step over that. Now the selected item is Tim Corey, so that's good. Now let's look at our list. Our list of available team members has nothing in it, so we can't remove it from them. And our selected team members has one person. So that seems like it should be displaying the right thing. So why is it that nothing here is displaying the way it should? Well, it would seem like the issue has to do with our wire up lists. It seems like this wire up lists isn't actually refreshing our data source since it's the same list. Now we can play around with something like select team member dropdown dot refresh and see if that works. And actually I'm going to take this, I cut it, I'm going to move it down here. Instead of wiring up the lists again, I'm going to do this instead. And this is a great time to debug. There we go. This is a great time to debug because we can learn a little bit more about how things are actually working and how to track down a problem. Because here's the deal. So far, my application has just kind of worked. And that really doesn't happen out of the gate that often, at least until you're well down the road of being a programmer. And even then, that's pretty much a rarity. I typically spend half my day debugging why my awesome logic didn't work. And so debugging skills are really important, and they also help you learn. Because as you track down problems, you may even find a bug in how C# works. Now, here's the deal with that. Don't assume that it's a bug in C# until you've eliminated everything else. I mean, everything else. Because 99% of the time, it's your bug. So, in this case, let's do a refresh instead of rebinding these lists and see what happens. So I have Tim Corey selected. I hit add member, and nope, that didn't do it. So I read about, and this is one of those Googling things, I read about a solution that seems a little wonky, but it was suggested as this is the way to do things. Take the drop down and say data source equals null. And then down here, data source equals null. So you set it to null first and then your list, and that should work every time because it changes that list and it forces a refresh. Let's just see what happens. Add member. Now he's over here and not over here. And that worked. So it worked the first time because it displayed Tim Corey over here, and it worked the second time when I hit add member and it moved him over. So that seems to work. So our solution, at least we found so far that works, is to set this to null first. Does that hurt anything? Probably not, but it would possibly trigger some event loops to happen, but we're going to have that anyways. For example, the selected item is going to change. Well, that's because that's going to be happening anyways, because Tim is going to move from here to over here. Therefore, the selected item over here will change. So that's going to happen anyways. Do we like this solution? It's not the best. Do I have a better solution for it? Not at this time. And so what I might do is I might put a to-do in here that just says, hey, when you get a chance, or a low priority to-do, when you get a chance, why don't you look into if it's a better way to do refreshing of a data binding? So, but otherwise, it works, and it's not terribly inefficient. Therefore, we'll leave it as complete. So now we have this wired up, we have this wired up, and we have this button wired up. We have a couple more to wire up. We have the delete selected, which is probably misnamed. That should probably be remove selected. In fact, let's go ahead and change that now. And also change the name up here. That way, everything is set before I create an event. So remove selected takes the person from this list and puts them back over here. So let's create that event. So it really is the same pattern, and I'll copy and paste here, but I have to remember to change things. The drop down is actually the team's member list box. So instead of being the select team member dropdown, it's the team members list box. So whoever's selected in there, pull them over, and then we'll do the opposite of right here. We're going to say selected team members dot remove p and available team members dot add p, and then wire up the lists again. Let's test that out. So we have Tim over here, we add him, we select him, we remove him, and now he's back. If we fire this off, nothing happens because we don't have anything selected. But notice I just broke my code. What just happened? Well, we found a bug in our code in that if no one's selected, weird things happen. So let's start this again. Get a fresh set here, and we're going to pause it on removing the selected person. So add Tim, that's cool. Don't select him, hit remove. The selected item is null. If we step over it, we now have a null person model. Well, we're going to remove null from the selected team, I guess. We're going to add null to our available team. Yep, that's kind of ugly. So now we still have Tim in the selected, and the available we now have one that is null. We continue, select Tim and say remove selected. It knows we've selected one. We skip over that and it says that person is Tim. We remove Tim from the selected team members list. Now it has 0. We add him to the available team members list. It now has 2, the null and Tim. And wire up the list. And it looks like these are both blank, but if I drop this down, we have a weird error in this list. Why is there a weird error in this list? Well, probably because we have a null value in it. So I said we'd handle exception handling in another video, and that's true, but we do want to have at least some basic error checking or some way of validating our data when we do this. So let's create a validation here. We wrap this right here. I'm going to select these 3 lines, actually 4, right click and say surround with if and tab. If P does not equal null, we're going to do that. So the same thing up here. Right click and say surround with if P does not equal null. All right, so there's our 2 checks, one for each of our buttons. Let's see if they work. We can't unselect Tim. He's already selected. But if we don't select anything here, we hit remove. We do Tim, he goes back over the list. So it looks like there's only one entry here, even if we hit the remove selected without selecting Tim. All right, so that's a bug fix already out of the gate. And that's one thing you want to do when you're creating this type of thing, where you're wiring up a form. You want to try the things that might break it. It always amazes me the things that users do just without thinking that are really awful. They do things that you're like, why would you ever do that? And so instead of reinventing the user, which we can't do even though we can fantasize about it, instead we have to reinvent our application to handle these users. Therefore, we have to try things that are just wacky, like not filling anything out and hitting create team or create member or remove selected, and what happens. So try those things out. As you come across them in your code, fix them, and if you can, have some really good testers test your application with the eye towards breaking it. Because you don't want testers who are all nice and follow all the rules, which some testers can be very conscientious to do. You actually want testers who are rebels, who say, nope, I'm going to break this thing and try every different way to break it. And that's really good for your testing experience, because you'll see what users will do when your application is in production. All right, so we've wired up our lists, both our dropdown and our list box. We've wired up the add member button. We've wired up the remove selected button. Now let's modify this button so it adds a person to this list. To do that, let's just double click on this button. There's already an event created, so it just takes me to that code, which is really convenient. So we already have this person model P, which gets created and updated. And in fact, we can actually say P equals globalconfig.connection.createPerson. That way we capture back the ID as well. And before we wipe out the values, or after, it doesn't really matter, but let's do before, we're essentially going to put them into, it's actually down here, we're going to put them into the selected team member and do the wire up. And copy this. It's the exact same code. We're going to add them to the selected team members list, and we're going to rewire the list up to refresh to show that new value. And that's it. If we run this, we have Tim Corey. Let's add a new person. We'll create Sue. She immediately goes in this list. I can remove her. She is now in this list. I can add her back. I can add Tim back. And then I can do no more. But I can remove Tim. I can add Tim. I can remove Sue. We can do all the different iterations and test things out. But essentially, everything we've started out to do is now wired up. We can add a member, remove a member, create a member, and it all works correctly with all these different, the drop down the list. The last thing we're going to do is going to be for the next video, and that is to actually create our team. This is a little bit more complicated in the fact that we're going to have to save a couple different pieces of information into our database or text file. So we're going to do that next, but before we go, there's one thing we haven't done yet. I wouldn't find that out, unless we remember, until we did this. If we do this, we're going to get this error right here. Not implemented exception was unhandled. So what happened? Well, what happened is we didn't implement the getPerson_all method. So let's do that. Let's implement that method. And you're going to love this because it's going to kind of blow your mind, I think, how easy this is. Return people file dot full file path dot load file dot convert to person models. Guess what I just did? I just implemented that get person underscore all. How did I know what to type right here? Well, it's actually right here. I just read it. Because whenever we save a person or insert a person into our text file, we first read all the people out of that text file. So how do we get all the people out of that text file? That right there. Therefore, we just put that line down here. I did the direct return instead of creating the output variable. Like I said, for testing purposes, that might be a little more difficult to test, but that's okay. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as it is. If I need to test it later, I'll work on changing that. But now, if we hit start, no error, and we have Joe Smith and Sue Storm in our list. Don't get confused, Sue Storm is not from the database we just created. Instead, I created Sue Storm in my text file as well. And just to show, we can say Bob Smith, Bob at smithy.com, and cell phone is 555-7756. There's Bob Smith. We can also remove Bob Smith. There we go. And now if we close this out, start it up again, we will see that Joe Smith and his brother Bob are both in the list because we added Bob the last time. So, implementing text files, not a big deal. So now our part 2 is complete. So we have these are all implemented right here. We just need to implement this button, create team, which takes in a team name and all the other data we created and creates a team out of it. Welcome to lesson 14 in the C# from start to finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to finish working on the create team form. So far, we've wired everything on the create team up except for the button that actually creates the team. So in this video, we're going to change that. Now we have to figure out first what this button should do. We have a team name, we have the people on the team. Sometimes I find it helpful to go back to the database where we design things out and see where this is going to live so we can kind of help see what our ideas were when we built this thing out. So we have here teams. Let's design this. It has just really two things, an ID and a team name. And then you have team members. And that has the row ID, the team ID, and the person ID. And that's it. So we have two tables to fill in. First one is teams, and the second one is team members. And that order is important because in this one, we create a record, we'll get this ID back. We'll use that ID right here when we also add each person. So it's going to be a two-step process. And the first thing you need to do is create our store procedures. We have the team get by tournament, but we don't have any inserts for the team or the team members. So let's create those. New store procedure. We'll delete out all of this. Again, I would leave this and actually fill it in if you're actually creating these store procedures. And the format is SP Teams Insert. Now, what do we need to know for creating a team? Well, we need the @team name. And if we look at the teams here, the columns, we can see team name is an nvarchar 100. So that's all that's coming in, but then I'm going to have this at ID int equals 0 output. And that'll be the ID going the other direction. We'll leave the note count in, but take out the comments. And we're going to say insert into dbo.teams team name values at team name. And then select at ID equals scope identity. And that's it. So we have our team name being passed in, and then we're pulling back that ID as an output, and that's we capture here, just like before. So we run this, and while we're here, let's also create the team members insert. So let's expand this out, and I'll create a new store procedure. The temptation here is to copy this and just modify it for what we need. But I'd recommend against that because, again, just like copying in code in C#, the likelihood that you miss one little spot and cause a problem is pretty high. So dbo.sp team members underscore insert. And here we have at team ID int, at person ID int, and at ID int equals 0 output. Take out the comments. We're going to say insert into dbo.team members team ID person ID values at team ID at person ID. And then again, select at ID equals scope identity, and we're good to go. So we'll run that, make sure it runs. We will refresh down here just to make sure those two do pop up on the list. So there is the team members insert, and there's the teams insert. So both of those are working, or at least they should. Let's come back over to here and double click on this button to create the event. So now we have the event, and what should we do here? And the decision here is, do we call two different methods, or do we call one method and have it do both jobs? So we have two different things going on. We have the team name being sent, and ID gets passed back. Then we send the list of IDs from here, and also the ID from the team, and then we have our team members list. So is that two actions or one? Now we have the idea of the single responsibility principle from the SOLID acronym, and the idea there is that each method does one thing. But the question is this one thing or two? Now I'm going to argue that this is one transaction. You can decide, nope, I want to do two different ones. But here's why I'd argue it's one transaction. Because you're creating the entire team. Both the name and the members are one set of data. They go to two different tables, and it'll be two different insert statements, but it's one set. Therefore, I like the idea of doing them together so we don't do half the job and then fail and not do the other half. So let's start at the iData connector, or connection. And we have here our create prize, create person, and now we need some type of create team. And if we look at our team model, we see we have a list of person model and a team name. So that's perfect. So we're going to say, let's put it up here. Doesn't matter where you put in the list. team model. We'll return the whole model all over again. Create team. Team model. Model. So we're going to pass in a team model, just like we do it with prize or with person. It's just a little more complex. And we're going to get back a team model because we're going to pass back in that ID. But if you notice over here, there is no ID. So let's add that. And also this ordering is bugging me. I'm not sure why you ordered it that way. I'm going to switch those around so that team name's above the members. All right, so just like with prize model, we have the ID. With team member, we have the ID, which also makes me think, do we have ID in person model? And I believe we do, but let's just check. Yes, we do. So we have all the IDs we need to be passing back and forth. So now we have a create team part of the contract, our iData connection contract, our interface. And so now each of these two connectors, SQL connector, and the text connector, they both need to implement that interface. So let's do that. Let's go into both and make sure that they both implement control dot and enter. That just creates our public method with the throw new not implemented exception. That's fine. We'll come back to text in a minute. Let's start with SQL. So here we have our SQL where it says, okay, you want to create a team? Great, go for it. So let's start with a using. And in fact, we can copy and paste this using statement because it's really the same thing. Oops, let's not copy a query. Let's copy and execute instead because it has the way we're going to do executions. So let's copy this and paste it right here. So we're actually going to do two different inserts. The first one takes in the team name. And the only other thing it takes in is actually an output, and that's the ID. So team name, we're going to say model dot team name. Since we copy and pasted, we have to be very careful to check everything. So let's go through, make sure we have our database is correct. It is. Then we have our team name, our ID. It's an output. We come down here. This is not correct. And come back over here to our SQL. I'm going to copy that and paste in right there. So we have the correct value or the correct name for our store procedure. We do have a model.id, and that is the team ID, so that's perfect. But before we return the model, we have to do some more work. What we need to do is we need to insert every one of those people into our table. We come back over here to our SQL, and look, we take in one person. So this team members table is going to have a number of rows per team, one for every team member. And doing that is fairly simple. We just need to do a loop. In this case, a for each. For each person model P in model.team members. So we'll loop through this. Oh, we already have a P. We'll say TM for team member. All right, so for each one of these, we have to do a new insert. Let's copy this. Paste it in there. All right, so instead of SP teams, it's team members insert. So we'll change that store procedure. And this is a tricky bit here. We already have a P, but it's a dynamic parameters, which we want to use. Therefore, we can just change it to not say var in front of it And now we're just going to overwrite that P every time, which is great. It's what we want. Now let's grab our parameters. So you have team ID and person ID. So at team ID, and that's model.id. And then the same for each one of them. We're not actually going to need to grab the ID coming back out because we don't need it in any way. So we can ignore that and instead do the at person ID equals, and it's not model because it's per person model, so we want to say tm.id. And they should already be filled in because these people are already in our database, and so we have IDs for all of them. Even if we add a new person, we first get the ID back after saving them, and then put them in our list. So we always have IDs for all of our people that we're adding to a team. So that's all there should be for the create team portion for SQL. So we'll ignore text for now, and we'll come back over to our form and the code behind. All right, so in here, first we want to create our team member object. So team model T equals new team model. T.team name, oops, not members, name, equals, we had to grab whatever the name of this is. It's team name value. So team name value dot text, and then the T dot team members equals, and that's just our list up here of selected team members. And notice it's a list of person model, and this is a list of person model. So that works fine. And now we say global config dot connection dot create team, pass in T. We can say T equals, just to capture it back out. And now we're done. Now the team has been created, and really this form should close because we're not going to leave this open to create a new team. We're going to go back to our other form that called this, most likely. But just to be on the safe side, what we can do is we can reset up all of this information. So let's create a note to just remind ourselves, hey, if you're not going to close out this form, reset it. So let's do that over here. So we're going to say to do, if we aren't closing this form after creation, reset the form. So I'm not quite sure how we're going to use this form yet. We haven't really talked about how these forms all interact, but I think that we're going to drive everything off of the create tournament form. And so create a team, it'll come back, it'll add that team, and then it'll say, oh, I want to create another team, and do the same thing over and over again. So in that case, we can just close out the form because that will wipe everything out. There's no reason to set everything back up new. So we'll leave it like that for now. And the only other thing we need to do for testing purposes is make sure we change this back to SQL. And now let's run this. Before we get too far though, I want to look at both the team table and the team members table. I'll run both of those. and they are both blank. So that's this place to start. Now let's run this and call it this first team. Let's call it team first place. I'm going to add Tim and Sue to this team, just so we have two. And then I'll say create team. Now remember, we didn't wipe anything out because we're going to assume that this form will close when we hit that create team. But let's go over our SQL and run this again. And we can see that I have the team first place down here. We can zoom in here. There's team first place, an ID of 1. And then we have two people, both on the team ID of 1. The first person is 1, the second person is 2. I would assume that that person 1 is Tim and person 2 is Sue. Now we could look that up if we wanted to. That's not hard. We could say select star from dbo.people where or ID, sorry. ID in 1, 2. And that it says, give me all the people that have an ID of 1 or 2. And that'd be Tim and Sue. So yep, that all seems to work just fine. So now let's wire up our text side. So let's first change this over to text, which right now will throw an error, which is great because then if we were to do this accidentally, we hadn't set it up yet, notice different people because we're in text now. We create team, it's going to throw that new not implemented exception, which is great. So let's go ahead and implement this method right here. Now again, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. So let's look at what I did in other areas. For example, here, I first load all of the prize model in, and then I find the max ID. I go up 1, I add the prize, I save that to the file, and then I return the model. So let's follow that same pattern, but now don't forget, we have two different ones we need to add. So first, let's look at the teams. And it's at this point you should have kind of a quandary you get yourself into. And you need to take a step back and think about what you're doing. Because the reality is, and here's where I'm going to land on this, the reality is we're not saving it to files. In the SQL table, we are. We're saving to two different tables. But there's not really a point to that. If you look at the team model, which we're passing in, if we look at that, we have an ID, great. We have a team name, great. And we have a list of person model. We don't have a separate model for these people. And by that I mean, if you go to the database and look at team members, there's the team ID, the person ID, and the ID of the row that they're entered in. We don't have that reflected in this model. And that's okay. We don't need to have that information. In fact, it's kind of worthless. Instead, we like to have the person model, which has their name and their email address and their cell phone number and all the rest. So we don't need to have two different text files. Instead, we need to have one text file that just handles the idea of having a list and how we're going to do that. Now, the list can be a little more complicated, and so we're going to figure out how to do that in a way that makes sense. But first, let's start with the basics. We need to have a file to save it to. So let's start there. Private const string, and this is the team file, equals team models.csv. All right, so there's our team file. And just like up here, we can say, let's get a list of team model call it teams equals, there's our file name, dot full file path, dot load file, dot convert to team model, plural, models. We don't have that yet. So we need to create that. So let's do that. Let's put it in the same spot as this convert to prize models. And it's okay that it's yelling at me right now. I kind of want that because I know I'm not done there yet. So we have these two converts, convert to prize model, convert to person model. So let's create another one. Public static list of team model, convert to team models. This list of string, we'll say lines. Okay. So what exactly does the text file look like? Remember, it's a comma separated list, so we probably have ID, comma, team name, comma, and that's where it gets kind of tricky. Because if we look at the team model, it's a list of person, which doesn't make sense to say the whole person. That's kind of duplicating information. So instead, what if we have a set of values that's separated? Now, normally it would be a comma separated list, but because this is a CSV file where it's already comma separated, let's do something else. So let's take the list of IDs separated by the pipe. That's going to look like, let's say 3 comma Tim's team comma 1 pipe 3 pipe 5. So that's what a row would look like. And so this represents the ID of the team, the name of the team, and then each ID of each person. Now we're not done there because we're going to have to rehydrate that. We're going to have to pull those people out and say, okay, we have these IDs. What's the full model for that person? So we have to do some other calls here to pull in our list of people. And so we'll do that at some point. But first, let's get this part of it done. So we're going to do a for each. Well, let's create a list first, sorry. List of team model output equals new list of team model. We're going to do a for each string line in lines. And we'll say string array calls equals line dot split, single quotes around a comma. Notice I'm just following the same pattern I have up here. And so now we have a team model, t equals new team model, t.id equals calls 0, t.team name, team name equals calls 1, and don't forget to wrap this one with a int.parse. And now we have to deal with that pesky last column, which is our list of IDs for people. So what are we going to do about that? Well, let's go back and look at our text connector real quick and look at the create person here. The first thing we do is we pull in the people file and convert it to a list of person or person model. That would get us every person that we have saved in our text file, which would give us something to look up then by ID. But this constant people file is in this file. Now we have two options here. One, we can load this down here and pass it in to the convert to team models. Or we can pass in just the string for the people file and then have it do all this work. I kind of like that second option better. So I'm going to copy its entire line, but then down here, pass in people file. Now that breaks this, and that's okay. Come back over here and say, comma, string, people file name. And now it's getting unbroken, at least as far as passing in information. Now, why is there only one parameter again? Again, this is because the first parameter is actually the output of this right here. And you can tell that because it says this in front of it. And that's the extension method, how it works. So the second parameter becomes the first visible one you see inside those parens. And that's the people file name. So up here, right after I do my output, I'm going to paste in that line. And then I'm going to change the file name to the passed in file name, people file name. And now I have a list of people. So now I can say string array. We're going to say person. Wow, there we go. IDs equals calls to dot split single quotes pipe character. So what does that do? It takes the third column, calls number 2, since 0, 1, 2, takes the third column, splits it by the pipe character, and puts that into an array called person IDs. Now comes the tricky part. How are we going to deal with looking up these people IDs? Not because looking up the IDs is hard. It's because what happens if we have an ID that isn't in our list of people? That could be a problem. Okay? So we have a couple options. One, we could gracefully skip over that person. Or two, we can blow up. I think for right now, we're actually going to blow up. Because again, that application in an uncertain state or a half-done state isn't what we wanted. So if the first record succeeds and the second record we can't find the person, that doesn't mean the team should have one less person on the team. It means we've got an error in our list somewhere. But in this case, we're going to blow up, and that way we know, nope, that didn't work. So for each string ID in person IDs, and we're going to say t.teammembers.add. And here's where we do a lookup. We're going to say people.where x arrow key x dot ID double equals int dot parse ID. And then we're going to say first, like so, and that should do it. Now there's a lot of curly brace, parentheses in there, and a lot of stuff going on. So let's break this down a little bit. So this right here, what it's doing is it's saying take the list of people, all the people in our text file, and says search for it and filter where the ID of the person in the list equals the ID from right here. So in theory, it should find only one person. We're doing a parse int on a string. Don't forget that. Otherwise, it's a string compared to an int, and that won't work. So the theory is each ID is unique, and therefore we should never have more than one. But C# doesn't know that, and so it says, I'm returning a list. And so we say, give us your first item. Now, if you did return 3 items in this list, it would still only give you the first one. But since we know it should be a one-to-one relationship, then the first one is the only one. Now, here's where it's going to blow up on this first. If there's 0 in the list, it's going to say, I can't do that, and it's going to explode. There is an option here, first or default. And what that will do is it will return null if it can't find a record instead of blowing up. But again, that wouldn't crash our application. Therefore, we could conceivably think that this is working when in fact it's not. So we're going to leave it like that. It's going to find the person object and add it to the team members list of object. So all that to say, for each line in our text file, add the ID and the team name, and then loop through and add the team members based upon splitting out calls to, which is this value right here, splitting this out by the pipe, and therefore we know which IDs, which we can then look up in our people list to find the full person object to add to our team members list. With all of that being done, we can return output. And now convert to team models is complete. We come back over here, no more yelling at us. And in theory, we have a list of team model called teams. Now we need to follow the same pattern as up here, where we get the ID. And in fact, let's just copy this and paste it. Current ID and teams.count is greater than 0. Teams order by descending by the ID, which is the same name as we give it for every one of them. So that's fine. Find the first, find the ID, add 1. That's our new current ID. Put that current ID in the ID area for our team. And then we're going to say teams.add model. So we've taken the model passed in, we've given it the ID, now we've added it to our list of teams we found from our text file, if any. And now we need to do 2 things. First, we need to say teams.save to team file and pass in the team file name and return model. Return model works just fine because we already have that, it's done. But this save to team file, that's not created yet. So we come back over here and we have save to prize file, save to people file, and now we will have public static void save to team file. This list of team models string file name. First, we're going to create that list of string. And that'll be what we save at the end. Then we're going to do our for each and say team model t in models. We're going to say we need to add a line for each one of them. But before we do, we have to address that list in there that we have to convert over to our pipe delimited set. So how are we going to do that? Well, we probably need to have another for each, but it seems like that's doing too much in this for each loop. So let's create another helper method. Let's create a private static and we have return type of string. That's what we want. And let's call it convert people list to string. Let's pass in a list of person model and call it people. So this method's job is to take that list of person model and return a string instead. That way up here, we can just do the same kind of thing, only instead of passing in just the value for that last one, we will pass that value to this method and use the returning string in this place. So that's a little complicated to kind of visualize if you're not seeing it at first, but that's okay. We're going to do it here. You'll see it, and then I think the light bulb will click on. You'll go, oh, okay, I know what I'm doing. So let's start with what we need. We need a string output equals an empty string. And the last thing we'll do is return that output. Before we do, we're going to do a for each person model p in people. And we're going to say output plus equals p.id. And in fact, let's do this as our special string here with a $sign in front of it. That way we can do the pipe right in line. So for each person in the people list, we're going to say add to the output this. First the ID, which will get converted to a string, and then the pipe character. So everyone's going to have that. So after the first entry, say the first entry is 2, it's going to look like this. After the second entry, say it's 5, it'll look like this. Now, before you jump the gun and say, okay, we're done, at the very end, the last thing we need to do is take off this, the trailing pipe character. And the way to do this is fairly simple. We're just going to say output equals output, if I can spell, dot substring, start at position 0, and go to output dot length minus 1. And finally, return output. So what's going to happen is, after we loop through, we're going to have something that looks like this. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to do a substring of our output. And what substring does is it takes a piece of our string and returns that value. We're going to start at position 0. Each character is one number. Starting at 0, it's a 0-based array. And so I said start at 0 and count this many characters. Well, the length, which would be all the characters, minus 1. And that starts at position 0, that's right here, then 1, then 2, and it says, well, I had a length of 3, so I stop at, 4, so I stop at position 3, right there, and therefore we're done. So 0-based arrays and with 1-based counts and all the rest can get very confusing. My encouragement to you is if you're not absolutely certain, what I would do is create a little test project that just does one thing. It is a very simple version of this. In fact, I did that just to double check to make sure this is the way it's supposed to work, because I always seem to get it wrong, except when I don't, and then I question myself. So just test this out in a simple fashion in a test project just to make sure that you have your counting correct, especially if you're doing things where you're counting only a certain number of characters, or you're going from the middle, or something weird like that where you really need to make sure you get your numbers exactly right. Before we go out of this method, we have one bug to fix. And you may not have noticed it, but take a minute and try and figure out, maybe pause the video and try and figure out what the bug is in this method. You figure it out? The bug here is what happens if we have 0 people in our list. Should we? No, we shouldn't. But maybe we did. Maybe we have a team and no people in it. If so, the for each would work just fine. It would say for each person model P in people, people's empty, therefore I never run. But down here, substring of output, which starts off as an empty string, so count of 0. So it says 0 to output length, that's 0 minus 1. Substring of 0 to minus 1, that's going to crash. So there's a few ways to handle this, but probably the easiest way is to come right up near the top and say if count equals 0, return empty string. And so what that does is it kind of short circuits this process. If there's no people in the list, there's no reason for us to loop through a list or to do the substring and all the rest. Just say if it's the count 0, return empty string, because that's what it would be. So that solves this method right here. So now, just like in here, we can say lines.add. We can do our $sign and the 2 double quotes, and semicolon at the end, and come back. We can start off with our t.id, and then our curly brace, comma, no space, curly brace, t.team name, curly brace, comma, another curly brace with no space. And then we're going to say convert people list to string and pass in t.team members. Then close that curly brace out. Now, this method, passing in a list of people, gets back a string of these pipe delimited items. That's going to put it in this spot right here. And so our end result is something that looks like this, which is exactly what we wanted. So the only thing left to do is to do our file.writeAllLines. And this is a baked into C# method, this file.writeAllLines. It takes in a file name, actually a file full path. So we'll give it the full path, and then an array of lines, or a list of lines. And that's our list of lines. So we've now saved to the team file. In theory, life should be good. Let's find out if it is or not. So we'll pull up our form. I'll also pull over my files here, just so we can see that there is no team models file. So let's create a team of second is best. Let's add both Joe Smith and Sue Storm, but not Bob Smith. We will create that team. And now the team models.csv has been created. If we open that with Notepad, I'll pull it over here. We can see that we have the ID of 1, second is best, and then that pipe delimited list of IDs for the people. So life is good. It seems to work. And with that, we have completed the create team form. At the beginning, it seemed a little intimidating with all this stuff going on, but we broke it down into sections. This section here, this section here, this section here, then this, and then finally the create team button. So by breaking it down into little chunks, sure, it took us a little bit, but we got the job done, and it wasn't that overwhelming. Once we started getting rolling in our system and the way we're going to do things, it really was just follow the pattern and do the same thing over again and make small little decisions, not big ones. Now that we've handled this form, in our next video, we're going to tackle something a little bigger. We're going to get to the create tournament form. This is the big one, because once we have this done, then our system is pretty close to complete. The only thing we'll have left after that is to load which tournaments we have so we can view them and the actual viewer. And those are kind of small. So stick with it. We're getting close. Let's finish strong, get this application at least up and running. And then we're going to come back through and make some improvements and kind of upgrade this with a couple different fun features that really make the application stand out and be more intuitive. So stick around for that. Welcome to Lesson 15 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to start working on the Create Tournament form. This is the big one. Once we get this form completed, we'll have a mostly working application. The best news is that while this is the most complex of our forms, by now we've already done most of the parts we're going to need. That means we shouldn't encounter too many issues. At least we hope not. So let's jump right in. Whenever I start a form, I like to break down the different chunks that I'm going to do. And so I review what the form does and then figure out what the logical chunks are. And right away in my review, the first thing I notice is these two boxes right here are different, and yet their labels are the same. Now that just means we have a copy-paste error, so I'm going to go ahead and resolve that before we get any further along. I'm going to change this to say prizes. And that just fixes that little issue right there. The actual label is labeled prize label, and the box is prize list box. So we're all good there. It was just the actual text right here for this label. Now, as far as the chunks that I'm going to break this up into, it's a little bit different because we're doing it on video versus you doing it yourself. Because here's the chunks if you're doing it yourself. I would populate this select team drop down first, and that'd be one chunk. Then I'd populate this list box right here, and that's another chunk. Then I'd wire up this add team, which takes whoever's in this drop down and puts them in this list box as the next chunk, because that way I can validate that this list is working. And finally, I'd wire up this list box. Now, because we're doing this on video, I'm not going to do 6 different videos for this one form. We're going to try and do it in 3. And so therefore, we're going to do all of these in one video. So we'll do a drop down, the add team, this list box, this prize box. All of these we're going to do in this first video. The next video, we'll wire up these delete buttons and the create new and the create prize buttons. We'll wire those up as well, make sure they're working. In the final video, we'll concentrate just on this create tournament button. So those are the chunks we're going to do. They're bigger chunks than I'd have you do if you're just doing it on your own, because on your own you can break it down into smaller parts and it makes a little more logical sense. So let's start with this select team dropdown. It's called select team dropdown. So we're going to go to the code for this, hit F7. And here's our code behind for our form. And the first thing I want to do is this is a list of teams. So I want a list of team model. I hit Control dot to add the using statement. Now I'll call this teams, or available team. Let's do available teams. Equals new list of teams. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us all the teams that are in the database, every one of them. And we'll put that in this list. Now, right now I have this as a equals new list of team model. We're going to go ahead and change that to either load the teams from the database or from the text file. So we'll leave it this way for now, just so we have something. And then let's work on getting that read for the team model. So we have the create team, but let's do the list of team model, get team underscore all. So it matches up, get team and create team. Get person all, get team all. So we're kind of matching the same patterns here. This is our new entry in our iData connection, which is our interface or contract. And now let's implement that. So we'll do our control dot here. And then we'll also do our control dots in our text connector so that both are implemented. We'll come back over to the SQL connector. We'll go find this. So here's our get team all in a SQL connector. So let's first of all copy this code for get person because it seems to function fairly consistently with what we're doing. I'll change output to be a team model instead of a person model, and we'll have to change the query to get the team model instead. Now, first of all, we need to figure out what store procedure this should be instead of SP people get all. So let's look for the SP team get all. We have an SP team get by tournament, and if we modify this to look at it, we can see that we get everything from a team and we join on the tournament entries so that we know, okay, it's this specific tournament. Well, we're not asking for a specific tournament yet. We're creating a tournament. So this isn't quite right. So we're not going to use that. Instead, we're going to create a stored procedure. We'll get rid of this stuff up top. And we'll say the name is going to be, we're going to follow the same convention. So DBO SP team underscore get all. We will have no parameters because we're getting all the teams. And for our select statement, be very simple. Select star from dbo.teams. All right, we'll put our semicolon at the end. And that's our store procedure. Very, very simple. Now, if we run this, just the select statement, we have right now one team, ID of one, and a team name of team first place. So we have one team in there. So let's create that store procedure. And we'll take that name. We're going to paste it here. And now we have a populated team model list, correct? Well, no, actually we don't. If we look at the team model, we see that we have ID, the team name, those are the things we got from the database, but then we have this list of person model called team members. We didn't get that from that SQL table. So how are we going to fill that? Well, remember that we have this other table in SQL. We have this table called team members. And if we look at this, let's select the top 1,000 rows. We see team ID of 1 for both of these. I'll zoom in here. And then the person ID is 1 and 2. So we have this linking tool that says, okay, here are the entries for this particular team. So we need to get team members get by team. So this looks like it's probably what we need. This SP team members get by team. We pass in the team ID and get back a list of people. And that sounds correct. So we need to call this store procedure. And we pass in @team ID. And how we do that over here? Well, we're going to have to loop through and call this for every team that we just downloaded. Because if we have 8 teams, each one of them needs to have that call by team ID to find out which people are a part of that team. So therefore, we're going to do a for each. For each team model, team in output. So the output right now is team model, but it doesn't have anything for that team members list. And so for each one, we're going to say team dot team members equals connection dot query, and this is a list of person model, DBO dot, there's our store procedure name, to list. And now what this does is for each team in our list of teams, we're going to query the team members list. Now, if you look at the store procedure, we're not actually returning just that, this right here. We're not returning this, just IDs, essentially. Instead, with the joins, we are returning the people. So, ID, first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number. They're people records. Therefore, we can do it right here. We can return a person model, which is ideal because we have a list of person model for the team members. So each team, we're going to run this query, and the results will get put in the team members list. Now, our output is not only our team name and ID, but also all the team members fully populated. So now get team underscore all should be correct. So now over here in the code behind for our create tournament form, instead of saying equals new list of team model, we can say global config, and we'll add the using statement there, dot connection dot get team all. Now we'll get all the teams and put them in this list of team model. Next, we need to hook up our dropdown to this list. So let's create a private void initialize lists. We're going to say in here that our lists, which we called select team dropdown dot data source equals available teams, and selected team dropdown dot display member equals, and we need to pick a display member to show. So let's look at the team model. And if you didn't notice what I did before, or didn't realize what I was doing, if you click on an object like team model and hit F12, it finds that definition. So it goes right to team model, it puts it over here as a not quite open tab. It's more of a preview tab. You can say keep it open, and then it'll make it a real tab. Otherwise, this will change based upon where you need to go. So I need to pick one property to identify this team model. And in this case, it's pretty simple. Team name seems to indicate exactly who we're talking about. So I'm going to copy that. And then here inside my double quotes for display member, I'm going to paste it. That way my casing is perfect, and I know that's not an issue. Now before we go any further, let's go ahead and check to make sure this part of it is working. So let's come down here to our program.cs, make sure we change this from text file back to SQL. And then we also need to change, instead of create team form, we're now on the create tournament form. If we run this, we're going to get this error. And you go, oh no, we messed something up. Well, yeah, kind of we did, but don't panic. Read the information. So additional information, which in the newer versions of Visual Studio, they fixed this so that this is much more clean and it puts the real information up top. But in this case, the real information is under additional information. And it says procedure or function sp team members underscore get by team expects the parameter at team ID, which was not supplied. Well, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? We didn't pass in the team ID, therefore we don't know which team to look up. So let's stop that. And we need to create a dynamic parameter list. So let's grab, we're just going to copy it from up here so we have the same pattern. And then we're going to say down here, let's just put it right in here. And we're going to say, instead of model dot, this is at, let's check to make sure, it's called at team ID. So I'm going to copy that. This is at team ID, and it's not model. We're inside a loop, so it's team dot ID. So we pass that in by doing comma P. All right, and that should be all we need. Let's start again and see what happens. Nope. It says procedure or function expects a parameter at team ID, which was not supplied. Well, we passed in the P, so why is this not working? And this, again, is not the time to panic. It's time to just look at, well, what's going on here? In here, we said P, and then we gave the command type, which we didn't do down here. So let's just do that and pass it in, and this time it runs. Okay, so we needed that command type of store procedure to tell it that it's a store procedure. Now, in the team list, we have nobody. That doesn't seem quite right, so let's debug this as well. This is one of those things where you get going, you're like, oh, I'm going to nail this thing, and then this kind of thing, hits. This is natural. This is normal. The way we've been going so far, we've kind of had it too easy. And so now we're starting to see a couple of bugs and errors. And that's a good thing because it helps us debug what's going on. And those debugging skills are really important because you're going to need them every day. So in this case, I'm going to find out if I'm actually even getting teams. So I am putting my breakpoint right after I get all the teams. So I'm going to put it right there. I'm going to start. And now it's already at the breakpoint. Notice the yellow highlight to say we're at the start of the for each. So let's mouse over output. And if you can see, output says it has one record. It has an ID of 1 and a team name of team first place. And no team members, which is great. That's perfect because we load those down here. So let's step into this for each. And before we start going any further, let's look at the team to make sure it is the correct team. ID of 1, team first place for the name. So yes, that's correct. We're going to add our team ID, which is 1. We're going to call and ask for a person model back. We're going to call this method. And we get back the team ID of 1, team first place, now has 2 team members. The second person, is Sue Storm, and the first person is Tim Corey. So that's right. So let's keep stepping through. It's going to return output. That's good. And now I've stepped into an area that I didn't really need to. This is the other half of the class. Notice the create tournament form. This is the, we have a partial class in 2 different spots. And so this is the other half of that partial class. I'm going to step out up here, which brings me back to this creation. I can keep going. And it's actually taking me too far. I shouldn't have stepped out because it treats the partial class like it's a whole class and doesn't know one from the other. So I'm going to stop it again. And this time I'm going to go to my create tournament form and put my breakpoint at the end of the constructor. I'm going to take a breakpoint out of this for each loop and start again. And now I'm here at the end of my constructor. My available teams is 1. Team first place, ID of 1, and it has 2 people in the list, Sue Storm and Tim Corey. So my team list is correct. So why is it that my dropdown is empty? Now hopefully this doesn't take you too long, but don't panic if it does. It's one of those things where when you stare at something too long, it actually makes the problem worse, not better. And so if you ever get stuck in a point like this, one of the things I encourage is that you step away for 5 minutes and do something totally different. I play a game on my iPhone. I just pull the iPhone out, play a game. It gets my mind off of what I'm doing, which actually helps me solve the problem. I'll come back and it'll be obvious. I'll go, oh, that's what I did. In this case, the obvious is I didn't actually call this method. If you don't call the list or initialize list method, then it never initializes the data source and wires everything up. Therefore, nothing in the list. Now, team first place is in that list. So, step 1 is done. It's a little rocky. We had a little bit of an issue, but we're back on track, and we got some valuable debugging steps in along the way, and we realized that we have to make sure that we follow through on every step we're doing. When I was done here, I said, oh, I'm done. And I didn't review how this fits in with the rest of the application. Now let's tackle the next chunk. I'm going to close out everything else. So close all but this, just to kind of clear my plate. I'll probably have to repopulate it with all those tabs, but I want to at least start fresh for now. Now, the next logical step you might think is to add the team. Because we've already started working on teams, let's complete that. But, and here's the issue, we don't have anything to add to yet. There's no place for it to go. So therefore, we need to come out over to here and populate this list box. Tournament players list box. So we'll hit F7 to go to our code. We're going to say list of team model selected teams equals new list of team model. The reason it's a new list of team model is because we don't have any teams selected by default. Now, if you're thinking, man, this feels familiar. It feels like we've done this before. We have. Create team form. Select a team member, that's a person, add them to the selected person list box. So it's the same pattern as over here, it's just now with teams here versus people in the previous form. So it should feel kind of familiar and it should follow the same basic pattern. So in the same way, we have our tournament players. Let's change that name too while we're here. It's really not tournament players, it's tournament teams. We have over here a select team dropdown. So we should have tournament teams list. That's a little more consistent with what we're doing here. So we have tournament teams list box. So down here in the initialized lists, we can say tournament teams list box dot data source equals selected teams. Tournament team list box dot display member equals, and I copy from up here, team name, and paste it down here. Because these both hold a list of team model, and so their display member should be the same for both of them. And that's really it for wiring up this list box. There's nothing more to do because there is no list. So it's not like we can say, oh, yep, we're working, although we could put some dummy data in there just to be sure. But I think we're okay seeing how we only have to write 3 lines of code. I think we're okay for now. And because that was so easy, let's look at the prizes list box. That would seem like we'd have a list of prize model selected prizes equals new list of prize model. And then down here, prizes list box dot data source equals selected prizes, and then prizes list box dot display member equals that string. Let's go over to the prize model and look at the prize identifier. I would think probably place name is going to be good, although we might want to have some type of property that combines 2 or more. But for now, I think place name is good. So let's just copy this. Let's grab place name and then paste it into our quotes. And now, with that little bit of code, we've wired up these 2 list boxes. Now that they're wired up, we can come back over here and work on this button. This button's job is to take the value from here and move it over into here. So I'm going to double click to create the event. And then before I go any further, just because I know I've already done this once with the create team form, I want to see what I did to the add member button. Just to see the pattern so I know, yep, that's what I want to do. And in fact, I might even copy this code and paste it over into here and comment it out. That way I can kind of follow the same pattern for 2 reasons. One, it keeps my code consistent. That way you don't see things done 2 or 3 different ways depending on which form you're in. And 2, it helps make sure that since I have a system that works, that I use that same system, which reduces the amount of errors I have in my code. So the first thing I did was I converted my drop-down value, the selected item, to the type. So in this case, I'm going to say team model T equals team model in parens, select team dropdown dot selected item. So that takes the selected person, or I'm sorry, team in the dropdown, converts it back over to a team model. Since they all are team models, that's not a problem. If they weren't, it would blow up. So now I've done that, I can say if T does not equal null, we can say available teams dot remove that team. So it's not available anymore because selected teams dot add T. So it's not available anymore because it's now in the selected list. And the final thing we did was we call the wire up lists. We don't have that. Or do we? Well, we kind of do. We call it initialize lists. So let's go ahead and change that so it matches, so the pattern stays the same. But there's one more thing that we did here. In this wire up lists, we first assigned the data sources to be null. Remember that reset our list and allowed us to rebind. And so let's do that here. I'm actually going to copy and paste. And just make sure that you do copy each time, otherwise you'll copy the previous, or you'll paste the previous one. And that wouldn't work. Okay, so now we're going to call the wire up lists to make sure that our lists have been updated. I can get rid of this comment. And now let's run this again. We only have one team, but if we add team, it moves out of here and into here. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. And believe it or not, the first 4 chunks of this form are done. We wired up this selected team list so it populates with all the available teams. We wired up the teams and players selected box as well as the prizes selected box. And we wired this button up that takes a person from the available list and moves them to the selected list. So that's it. That's all we had to do in this first video. 4 small chunks. And those chunks were really fairly easy. We had a couple of glitches, but they're fairly easy. And we're really quite a ways towards getting this whole form done. In the next video, we're going to wire up this create prize button. Remember, we already have the form that creates the prize, but we somehow have to call that form, get the data back, and put it in this list. Because create prize works a little bit differently in that we don't have a drop down of available prizes. We decided back in our planning stage that we weren't going to do that because we figured that prizes were pretty much specific to the tournament and wouldn't be reused. So we'll create prizes specifically for this tournament. So we'll wire this up to that form and get the data back and put it over here. We'll also wire up this right here, this button. It'll be a similar mechanism as this create prize button in that it will call that other form we just did that creates a team. And then when it comes back with a filled out team, it's going to put that team in this list. And finally, we'll wire up these 2 buttons to remove people or remove teams and remove prizes respectively. So that's kind of a bigger chunk it seems like, but in a lot of ways most of it's already done. Welcome to lesson 16 in the C# from start to finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to continue working on the create tournament form. In the previous video, we started working the form by wiring up the lists in the dropdown. Now we get to connect our create forms to the create tournament form. Here we have our create prize button, and we have our create new, it looks like a link here, but that does the same thing only for a team instead of a prize. So these 2 are the first we're going to wire up, and this may seem a little intimidating because we're going to call a different form and have it talk back to us. And how you do that. And this is one of those areas where people often get it wrong, in my opinion. And that's by tying this form, the create tournament form, directly to the form we need to call. For example, the create prize form. The create prize form shouldn't know about this create tournament form. And that's where it gets a little tricky, a little bit, you have to think a little more about it before you just do something. Because there's ways to get it done, and then there's ways to get it done right. And so we're going to try and get it done right. So let's start with the create prize button. So in here, let's just list out the steps. We need to call the create prize form. All right. Next, we need to get back from the form a prize model. That's the tricky part. And then finally, we need to take that prize model and put it into our list of selected prizes. And that's the easy part. So let's start off with an easy part. Let's call the create prize form. And so these notes right here are great. They're one-liners. So I can then put code right underneath them. And then this line describes what this code down here does. So it starts off as notes of what I should do, and it ends up as notes of what I am doing for each of these sections. So to call a form, we do create prize form. Let's just call it FRM equals new prize form, because it's a class, and so we have to instantiate it. So create prize form, and then it's just frm.show. And that's it. And now that form will pop up whenever we click our button. Let's just check that to make sure. If we click the button for create prize, up pops the create prize form. So that at least works. So now, how do we get it so that when that form does pop up, we fill the form in that it actually puts the prize into this list over here? So we need to pass back our prize model. And that's where the question is going to come in. So first, let's look at our prize form and just verify that when we create this prize button click, that we have a prize model that we've created, and we do. Now we haven't passed it back to itself, so let's do that. That way it has the ID back in it. So now we have the fully completed model with ID, but now what? Well, actually, before I get there, I want to point out one thing. This is actually not necessary to do. I often forget about that and just do it, but the reality is that this is, again, the address to our house. So it says, 123 Sesame Street. That's where this house lives. So in this create prize, if we look at that, I can't go directly to it because it's an iData connection. So let's go to the SQL connector and look at the create prize. If we look here, we see that the model we take in, we then add in the ID property this value. That means that without doing anything else, we've modified this model. Therefore, we don't need to take this return value and do anything with it because we've already got it. So it's just one of those things that I often forget about it. I forget that we're passing around essentially reference types, or not quite reference types, but that address. We're passing the address around, not the actual house. So that's just something to keep in mind before we continue. But we have this model. It's now fully complete. So when we create the prize button, the next thing we want to do is send that prize model back to the caller and say, okay, here is the value, and we're done. So we're complete. So how are we going to do that? And the first way we could think about to do this is, since we have this constructor here, create prize form, we could pass in a prize model. So over here, we could pass in a prize model that we know about in this form, and then add that to our list of selected prizes. And as the user populates it and saves it, the form will just close because it's the same address again, remember, so that when the living room gets filled in the other form, the living room is filled over here because it's the same house. They're both using the same address. The problem with that is, what happens if I say, oops, I made a mistake, I don't want to create a prize? Well, then we have this weird prize with nothing in it in our list of selected prizes. And that's just not going to work. Now, the next idea is the one that people often do. And that's the idea that we can pass in the instance of this create tournaments form to our create prize form, pass this whole instance in, and then have a public method that's something like save prize or something like that. Well, what that means then is in our create prize form, in the constructor, we have to say create tournament form. And so it has to be tied to the create tournament form, and no other form can then create a prize. And that doesn't seem like it's a great idea. I mean, maybe right now we don't have any other location that might want to do that, but we might in the future. And especially if you're in a organization where you have a large application, you definitely don't want to lock your forms down to being so tightly coupled to each other. It's called tight coupling. And so instead you want loose coupling, the idea that they don't really know about each other, but they can work with each other. And so that's what you want, is some kind of loose coupling. So what we're going to do is in our Tracker UI project, we're actually going to create an interface. So right-click on Tracker UI and say Add, New Item, Interface, and let's call this the iPrize Requester. Okay, remember we call it I at the beginning for interface. Make the interface public. And this is going to have just one method in it. And it's going to be a void, meaning it returns nothing. Team complete. Oops, not team complete. Prize complete. And it's going to pass in the prize model. Add the using statement for that. Model. So what does this interface do? Well, it says whoever implements this contract will have one method called prize complete that returns nothing, but that takes in a prize model. How is this helpful? Well, check this out. If I take this interface, come over to the create prize form and say you have to pass in, let's call it caller, iPrize Requester caller. So now it's saying someone's going to call you. We don't know who, but they will have this contract. So pass it in as caller, and then up here we're going to say iPrize Requester calling form, and then in our after initialize components, we can say calling form equals caller. So what that does is it creates a variable at the class level that stores whatever's passed in to our constructor. And why is this valuable? Well, we need to know this outside of this scope. So right now, caller is only available inside the constructor scope. But now you want to have it available in this create prize button _click event. Because what we're going to say is calling form dot, and notice here we have the force standard from Microsoft equals get hash code, get type, and toString. We also have this method called prize complete. And it takes in a prize model. We have a prize model called model. And with that, we have called our parent, whoever called us, we've called them and said, I'm done, and here's that model you asked for, the fully completed model. And this model will only be created if it's a valid form and they said, yes, I want to create that prize. Now we can actually get rid of these. I'll comment them out for now because we're actually going to then close our form. this dot close, which will close this current prize form because we're done. We have said, yep, we're complete, and here is the completed value you asked for. So now we can come over to our create tournament form, and we have an error. Create prize form FRM equals new create prize form. Nope, we need to pass in iPrize requester. Well, we don't have one of those. Or do we? Nope, we don't. But we can say iPrize requester. This class is going to be our iPrize requester. This class being our create tournament form. We just need a control dot here and implement that interface. And now we can pass in this. Now, what is this? Well, the this keyword represents this specific instance. Meaning, inside of our fully built house, we can say, I know who we are. I know where we are. And so basically we look outside the front door, we read off of the mailbox our address and hand it to you and say, this is where we're at. So this represents this specific instance. This instance being a create tournament form class, but more importantly for the create prize form, we're also an iPrize requester contract fulfiller. We said, yes, we'll fulfill the iPrize requester contract. Therefore, we can pass that into this create prize form just fine. Now, does that mean we're locked into then only this form can call create prize? No. Anything. It doesn't even have to be a form. Anything can call this create prize form as long as they implement the iPrize requester. Now we're loosely coupled. The prize form doesn't really know who we are. It just knows that we implement the interface. Now the create tournament form knows about the prize form because it has to know that specific instance to call. And that's okay. So now we have to actually implement this interface. So what happens when the prize is complete? Well, that's actually these two right here. So let's cut them out of here. And now really, the create prize button just opens up the form. And here is where the magic happens. Actually, this step is already complete. The get back from the form a prize model, that's right here. So now we just need to take that model and add it to our list. Selected prizes dot add model. And the final step is then to wire up the lists again because our list has changed and you want to see that. Now that should be everything we need to do. Let's find out if it actually works. We're going to run this. And we're going to say create prize. And that pops up our form. Let's call this prize. The place number is for 4th place. And the place name is almost bronze. The prize amount is $5. Create prize. It went away, and we have now a prize in the list called almost bronze. So that's it. We've actually accomplished our mission of wiring up this button. It really wasn't that hard. We just had to know the steps to do. And now that we know the steps to do, we can do this one much easier, much more quickly, because it's the same process. So this time, let's do it in a little different order. Since we know we need that interface, let's right-click on our our project, and say Add New Item, Interface, and we'll call this iTeam Requester. We'll make it public. We'll add that one method to it. Void team complete, team model, control dot, add the using statement. And now our interface is complete. We'll copy that and save it. And now in our create tournament form, we need to add that interface as well. And we'll control dot to implement it. Now notice that this class inherits from form. And you can only inherit from one thing. But inheritance means it brings with it the methods and properties and other public items from that form class. But then it also implements not one but two different interfaces. And you can implement as many interfaces as you want, because an interface doesn't actually bring in code. It just is a contract. And it says you will fulfill this contract. You can have extra stuff. And boy, do we. We have lots of extra stuff. And that's okay. We just need to at least have the items that we said we would when we said this contract is attached to this class. So we implemented iTeamRequester, but let's go down and actually wire it up. Okay, that's pretty easy. Selected teams.add model and wire up lists. And that's it. So now this is wired up. So we can come back over here to our design, double click on the create new, to the link clicked. Notice it's a link clicked versus the click, and that's because this is a link versus a button. A little bit different, but the default event is what we wanted, so that's good. So we need to do a create teams form, frm equals new create teams form. We're going to pass in this. Now it doesn't take that yet, and that's okay. frm.show. So the last thing we need to do is modify our create team form to take in our interface. Caller. And we will say private iTeamRequester calling form. And then after initialize components, we will say calling form equals caller. So now the create team form at least knows who to call when we've completed a team. So now you can come down here to the button that actually creates the team. And if you're not sure which one it is, now it says create team button underscore click. You could open up the form, double click on the button, and it will take you to that event. As a to-do here, if we aren't closing this form after creation, reset the form. We can actually take that out because we are closing the form. And also we can take out this t equals, we don't need it. And instead we can say we need to call the calling form dot team complete t, and then this dot close. So we called the parent and said, yep, we're done. And then we also close this form. And now if we run this, we should be able to add a team as well as adding a prize. So we have one team here, team first place. Let's add them. And now we can create a new team. And it brings up this box right here. Let's call this place the Uncanny Losers. And we only have 2 people. Let's add a member. Oops, let's remove a member. Let's add a new person. Joe Smith, Joe and Smithy.com, 555-1111. and then his brother Billy Smith, Bill at smithy.com, 555-2222. So now we have a new team called the Uncanny Losers with Joe Smith and Billy Smith. We create that team, and there they are, Uncanny Losers. So it looks like everything is wired up the way it should be. Now we just need to wire up these delete selected. And actually, I believe the other one said remove selected. Let's check that out. The create team says remove selected. Let's keep that same syntax. So, and let's get rid of all these pins that I don't need. Let's close all documents and open up this one. All right, so let's change this. Go to properties. And instead of delete selected, we're going to say remove. And we'll come down here and also change this language to say remove. And do the same thing down here. Change both the name and the text to say remove. And then let's double click on this one right here. And now we need to remove one from the list. Again, we've done this before, so let's go to our Create Team form, open it up, double click on Remove Selected, and here we have the Remove Selected Member button. I'm going to copy this, I'm going to close it out, and I'm going to close out this as well. Oops, not this one, this one. And over here, I'm going to paste this in and comment it out. Again, this just gives me a pattern, so I know that, yep, I'm doing this right. And so we first need to grab the selected player or team. So team model, T equals team model in parens, team members list box. Nope, that's not it. What's it called? It's called Tournament Teams List Box. Tournament Teams List Box dot selected item. So we've taken a selected item, cast it to team model, it's a team, and then put that into our variable. And said if T is not equal to null, selected teams dot remove T, available teams dot add T, and then wire up lists. So it really is almost exactly the same as here. It's just a little bit different in how we do it. So in this case, we have tournament teams list box and selected teams and available teams. So that's how we do the remove a selected team or player from this box. Now for the prize, and I'll do both in the same shot since they're pretty similar. I'm going to say prize model P equals prize model prize list box, prize as list box dot selected item if P does not equal null, selected prizes dot remove P, and available, we don't have an available prizes. So we can take it out of the list, but here is the one rub, the one issue, and that is if we take it out of this list and we have nowhere to put it because we're not storing those. Remember, these are specific to the tournament and we're not going to worry about reusing them for different tournaments. So if we take it out of this list box we're really saying we don't want it. Get rid of it. Now here's where a debate's going to come in. Because if we get rid of it here, we should probably delete it. As in remove it from the database, remove it from our text file, everything. But that raises the question, database is fine because the database keeps track of which IDs it has used, and it makes sure that it doesn't reuse them. But what if, instead of this being the create tournament form, what if you're modifying a tournament? And we said, I don't want those prizes, remove them, and they get deleted. And then we say, oh, never mind, I'm not going to save this. Well, it's kind of too late. Those prizes have been deleted. Whereas if we didn't save it and we also didn't delete those prizes, then those prizes would still be there and nothing would have changed. So that could be an issue. It's definitely an issue with a text file because if we create a prize, that gets an ID of 1, we create 3 more, they get IDs of 2, 3, and 4, but then we delete those prizes. So we delete 2, 3, and 4. Now we're going to add a new prize. It's going to get an ID of 2, not 5. Because it doesn't see that the max ID is actually supposed to be 5. There's nothing to tell it that. So that could be an issue if we remove something but then didn't really save the record or had some other kind of issue. And so in this case, I'm thinking that even though we may create prizes and then disconnect them from everything and they kind of sit there, I think we should leave them where they're at and just not delete them. And so that's something you're going to weigh. But if you want to say, no, you know what, I'm going to delete it, then all you do is put that in the code right below this line. But for us, this line does all we need it to do. We're not going to save anything. We're not going to save a delete or perform a delete. So now let's test to make sure this form works the way it's supposed to. Let's add a team. Let's actually add 2 teams. Notice Uncanny Losers has been saved. Let's create a prize. Prize, the place number is, let's make it a 1 and say first winner, which makes no sense, but that's okay. $100. Create the prize. Now let's test removing. Let's remove Uncanny Losers. They go out of this list and back into this list. Let's remove the first winner. And nothing happens. And the reason why is because we didn't actually put that wire up lists after this item right here because we got distracted. And that's why it's always good to follow a pattern because it's very easy to see what you have and have not done. So let's just test this again. Always test it again, even though you're fairly certain it's going to work. We will create the prize. Create a prize for 10, 10th place, $1. Create that prize. 10th place is in the list. Remove selected. Now nothing is in the list. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. And that wraps up all the pieces that we needed to do today. We wired up the create new link and the create prize button. Both of those add to the respective list boxes. And we also wired up the remove selected for both the team and players box and also the prizes box. Now before we wrap up for today, there's one thing that you may have noticed, and some of you may be going crazy thinking that we've already broken our application. And that's because in the last video, we wired up the selected team, the list box for the teams, and also the prizes. And we implemented everything in SQL. But we didn't implement anything in the text files. So that was an oversight, and that's one of those things where we use that not implemented exception to our benefit in the fact we could compile for SQL, but we never actually tested it by switching over to type text file. And if we did that, we'd get that error, throw new not implemented exception. Now the good news is that no matter how far down the road we got, if we try to switch over a text, we'd get that error. So we'd know that yes, we've got a problem. So let's go ahead and actually, in this video, finish off this get team underscore all entry. And if we look up here to our create team, we see a list of team model called teams, teamfile.fullfilepath.loadfile.convert to team models. That is the code we need. We copy it, we paste it, we return it. Because this returns a list of team model, which is exactly what we need. Let's make sure that works. We'll run this, no crash, and now we have no teams. So let's create a new team. And we'll say the team name is, let's call it the best team. We'll add Joe Smith and Sue Storm, and we'll create that team. And we have the best team now in our list. We can also remove the selected, and it's now in our drop-down. Let's close this out, start it up again, and notice that our drop-down is empty. So we have some kind of issue going on, but we're not quite sure what yet. So let's do a little bit of diagnostic work as to why this isn't getting us what we need. So let's put our breakpoint on this line and run again. And this time we break in this line, we're going to step into our code. So first we get the full file path. Then we load the file. Notice here's the file name. It reads all the lines. Then we convert to team model. And notice here's all the lines of our file. It says one line. It says ID of 1. It's called the best team with person number 1 and number 2 in the list. Great. So now we create our output model, which is empty. That's perfect. We load our people model. Let's step back out of that and step over that code. And that gives us our list of people. And we have Bob Smith, Sue Storm, and Joe Smith. Notice IDs 1 and 2 were Joe Smith and Sue Storm. So for each line in lines, we have one line. So we'll do this once. We're going to split on the comma. And now we have 3 columns. And those columns are 1, the best team, and that one pipe 2. So now we parse that int for ID. The ID is 1. The team name is the best team. That's fine. We take calls 2, which is our 1 pipe 2. We split it based on the pipe. And now we have 2 person IDs, a 1 and a 2. And we say for each string ID in person IDs, and we're going to say ID parse, and we're going to say people, where x.id, that's the ID of each individual item, so 1, 2, and 3, equals the parsed value of ID, which is 1. Take the first one, add that to our team members. Let's skip over that. and look at our team members. We have 1. And that first person is Joe Smith, ID of 1. That's great. And I'm going to step over this again. And what step over does is it kind of skips going into anything in this line, and instead just continues on to the next line in this file. So now team members is 2. That's great. I don't have any more people. I don't have more lines. So I return our output, which is 0. Well, that doesn't seem right. Why is output 0? Well, if we look, we created this team model T, we populated it, but we never said output.add T. There's our problem. So, that's what stepping through the code does. It shows you where your problems are because you start seeing unexpected results. And that's where you start looking even heavier at what's going on. Now if we run this, it should be that if we start this, that we can go ahead and take this breakpoint off and just hit continue. Now we have in the dropdown the best team. If we add that team, it goes out of this list. And if we remove it, it goes back into this list. So now we have a working text version as well as our SQL version. All right, so that's a little bit of back work, stuff we forgot and stuff that we needed to work on making right. And that's going to happen. You're not going to get everything perfect the first time. You're not going to remember everything. And especially when you're starting off, you're going to get a lot of bugs because you forgot where you were. And you've even noticed when I've been doing this, I've had a couple bugs where I just forgot to finish what I started. And so that's where I encourage you to write things down or make notes or add to-dos. And especially if you're thinking about things that aren't really on the line you're working on right now. Instead of thinking down those paths, stop, write it down, and get back on the main path. And what I mean by that is I remembered that I hadn't implemented that text side of things. I remember that a while ago. But instead of stopping what I was doing and interrupting that flow, I just made a note of it. And then I didn't have to remember to do that. And that remembering kind of eats up brain power. And so instead I put it on my legal pad and said, do this. And then I can come back to what I'm doing and give it my full concentration because I'm not worrying in the back of my head I'm going to forget something. So that's what I encourage you to do. Write things down, use patterns like I've done. So in the code behind for this, we have these patterns here that I actually copy and pasted from the other form just so I could see the same pattern and do the same pattern. Because doing the same pattern every time makes it easier to spot when you've forgotten something. Like even here, it's kind of obvious to see that this pattern doesn't quite match up to this, in that I have 2 items here and only 1 here. Now it's intentional because we don't have anything to add it to, but at the same time you're going, wait, that might be an issue. And that's great. It's triggered your brain to say, I recognize this pattern and it's a little different. And so I want to make sure that that different is okay. If you didn't have this pattern, you would never look at a line of code and just go, that doesn't look right. So those patterns really help you keep yourself in line. All right, so let's review one more time to make sure we've got everything. We have wired up our dropdown and this link, these 2 buttons, these 2 lists, these 2 buttons, and now we're just waiting to wire up this create tournament button, which takes in the tournament name, the fee, and then the values for these 2 entries and saves it in the database. Now, the cool thing is we're going to do more than just save in the database this next time. Because yes, we're going to save this information, but then we actually have to take this information and scaffold out our tournament. Meaning, if we have 4 teams, we have to pick which 2 play each other in each of the 2 first games. And so we have to create that list so that we can start our actual tournament, which is, it's going to be great because we actually see something working. Welcome to Lesson 17 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to mostly finish the Create Tournament form. At this point, we only have the Create Tournament button left to wire up. So why is it we're only going to mostly finish? Well, this part is really 2 different ideas. One is about saving the data to the database. The other is about setting up the matchups for our tournament. I want to break those 2 apart so we don't get confused on what we're going to do where. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm anxious to get this form working, so let's dive right in. Okay, we have our button here, Create Tournament. Let's jump right in and at least create the event by double-clicking. Okay, we have the event. Now, what goes in here? And this is where I do my comments again, just so we have the different steps, and then we can do that step one by one and make sure we've got them all done. Our first step is going to be to actually create the tournament itself, taking the name, the entry fee, and actually creating that record for it. In the database, we have the tournaments table. And if we look at this table, we're going to see we have the tournament name, the entry fee, and if it's active or not. Now, when we create a tournament, it's active. So that we already know that information. So come back over here. Let's say create tournament entry. Now, why is that first? Well, we also have to save the prizes. But if you come look at the table over here for tournament prizes, we'll see we have the tournament ID and the prize ID. Well, a tournament ID comes from creating this record in the tournaments table. Therefore, we need the tournament ID for this, for the prizes. Therefore, the prizes come after we create the tournament. And the same with the entries. The entries, we have tournament ID and team ID, which means that we're going to take everyone in this list, take their ID as well as the tournament ID, and create an entry. So therefore, we can say create all of the prizes entries, and then also create all of the team entries. So those are the 3 jobs we need to do first. And then once all of that is done down here, and this will be for the next video, we need to create our matchups. Now let's take a peek at our tournament model. Our tournament model has the tournament name, the entry fee, the teams entered, the prizes, and the rounds, which that will be once we actually create our matchups. We'll populate that with our rounds. So what it looks like is we can create this model here without the rounds filled in. We can leave that blank, but everything else filled in, and then we can say save that entry and have either the SQL connector or the text file connector save all the information we need in the various tables. So let's do that. Let's first create our tournament model. We can do that right now. That's pretty simple. Tournament model. Let's call this TM equals new tournament model. TM dot, let's start with a tournament name, equals tournament name value dot text. Now TM dot entry fee equals, what do we call this? We call it entry fee. We did entry fee value dot text. Now that's not going to go into entry fee because entry fee is a decimal. So there's a few different things we could do. One we could do is just the easiest is say decimal dot parse this text. Now the only issue there is if the user decided to put something besides a number in that box, it's going to explode. And so that's probably not the best solution. And this isn't an area where I would want the application to crash. Instead, I want the application to not go any further. And that has a key distinction between crashing and not going any further. In this case, what I'm going to do is, instead of doing a parse, I'll do a try parse. I'm actually going to take this away from here. And let's for now just put a 0 there just to have a placeholder. I'm actually going to come up here before we even create our tournament model. I'm going to say validate data. I'm going to say decimal fee equals, let's start 0, and then say bool fee acceptable equals decimal.tryParse entry fee value dot text comma out fee. Now what this does is it says I'm going to try to convert this value right here, the entry fee value dot text. I'm going to try to convert that to type decimal. If I do, it will send it out through this fee variable. And if I don't, it will send a 0 out to fee, and it will send a false as the result of this method into my Boolean. Now, this isn't the first time I've done this, so let's just move on. We're going to say if fee acceptable, let's actually say not fee acceptable. Again, if you'd rather say fee acceptable double equals false, that's fine too. We can do a, for now, messagebox.show saying you need to enter a valid entry fee. And then we can also do, we can give it a caption. It says invalid fee. And then we can go on and give it buttons if you want and all the rest. Let's give it a button, messagebox buttons dot OK. And then after that, the icon will be a error. That's a little more complicated message box than normal, but essentially all we're doing is filling in more values that are normally defaulted. And so the message box buttons.ok is the default value, but that allows me to specify it and make sure that everyone knows. But then I have a caption up at the top of the message box as well as the actual value of the message box. And then this message box icon.error just gives it a different icon. It's that red icon that makes sure you know, oops, I did something wrong. So that lets the user know there's a problem, but we still need to do the return. And what this does is it stops this processing at this point, no further. So we know that if you get to this line right here, this is a valid fee. Otherwise, if it was not acceptable, we'd be kicked out. Now we can say tm.entryFee equals fee. Now let's move on to the prizes. Now the prizes are stored in the selected prizes. So you can loop through those and say for each prize model prize in prizes, selected prizes. So for each prize in the selected prizes list, we're going to say tm dot, not get type, prizes dot add prize. We could do that, and that's going to loop through each selected prize and add it to our prizes list. And that'd work if we need to modify something in each item or if you're only selecting certain ones from this list. But since this entire list is the selected prizes, we can make our lives even easier and not even do a for each. tm.prizes equals selected prizes. Because this is a list of prizes, or prize model, and this is a list of prize model. And they could also say tm.entered teams equals selected teams. And now we've populated our tournament model. Now we can actually save it. So, just like before, the first thing we do when we want to save something is we go to iData connection. And we're going to say, let's do up here, tournament model, create tournament, and pass in a tournament model. So it follows the same pattern as all the other creates. We're going to pass in one model and get one model back. Now that model coming back will have the ID, which we don't have yet. So let's create that. And in fact, just to make our lives easier, we can copy it from another model, simply enough, because the ID is basically the same thing. It's just a unique identifier for the tournament. All right, so now we have an ID to pass back if we need that ID. Let's save this. And now SQL connector is going to yell at us. We implement the interface by doing Control dot and hitting enter. And now right here we need to create that tournament. Before we do, let's go to text connector and do the same thing and implement that. Let's save that. And now over here in our SQL connector, we can actually put the logic in to save our tournament. Now I can copy the code from up here just so I have the structure of what I'm going to do. Again, we're using the same structure. That way it's similar in how we do things so we can expect certain things and so that certain things pop out when they're wrong. So before we go any further in this though, I'm actually going to comment out everything in here and uncomment it if I need it. Now, before we go any further, though, we need to actually have some kind of insert statement for each of the three of our tables. So let's create one for tournaments first. So right-click on Store Procedures, New, Stored Procedure. We're going to call this, based off the same naming convention as before, dbo.sp tournament underscore insert. Now what parameters does it need? Well, let's find out by doing our insert statement first. Insert into dbo.tournaments. And our values are, let's expand out the tournaments and the columns. So we need a tournament name, an entry fee, and we can leave the active out. Actually, we'll leave it, we'll have it added, but we won't actually create a parameter for it. Instead, what we'll do is just assume that every time you create a tournament, it's immediately active. So we'll say at tournament name, and that's a nvarchar 200. And at entry fee, and that's of type money. Notice I knew those two by looking at the columns. That's nvarchar 200, that's money. Now we can say values at tournament name, at entry fee, and active is 1. 1 would be true. So there's our procedure for inserting tournaments. I copy that. And here I will actually paste it in. And then I have my @tournament name and @entry fee. So @tournament name. And I will copy this and paste it and say entry fee. And the last thing I noticed, because I'm following the same pattern, is that I have that @ID, which is an output. But if you look over here at my procedure, I don't have that. So I need to add @ID int equals 0 output. Now, I can't run create procedure again because I've already created this procedure. So I have to change it to alter. And I run this, and that works. Now, right now it's yelling at me because it says, I don't know what that name is. But that's because my editor window is not caught up to the latest values. IntelliSense has not been refreshed since I ran that create statement. So if I hit Control-Shift-R, that'll refresh after a minute, and now it says, oh, yep, I know what that is. And now if I were to try and change this to create, it would say, you can't do that. There's already one in the system called that. So that allows us to know if we're on the right track or not, but you have to refresh that IntelliSense. Otherwise, it has stale information. So now we have our ID passing out, and that's good. So now I can uncomment this. And it should be mostly good except for this whole model thing. All the information is wrong here. Instead, we have to get the correct value. So I'll Control-J on each one of these and pass in the correct values. And now I'm going to do the SP tournaments _ insert. That's right. Grab back the ID. Perfect. But then this for each here, we want to change. So instead of model.teammembers, we want model.prizes. We'll do prizes first. And we'll say for each prize model PZ. And that will change how we do this insert here. Before we do, let's actually create that insert. So we're going to minimize that. We will create a new procedure. Wipe out all of this. Say again, following conventions, dbo.sp prizes. And it's actually tournament prizes. SP tournament prizes _ insert. Again, we can get rid of some of this stuff, a little housekeeping. And then we'll also expand out the tournament prizes column so we know what we're dealing with. And we will say we have the @tournament ID int, @prize ID int, and @ID int equals 0 output. And now we can say insert into dbo.tournament prizes, and the values are tournament ID and prize ID. Values @tournament ID @prize ID. And then we need to do a select @ID equals scope identity. And if you remember, we didn't do that over here. Again, patterns. I really should have pulled up a store procedure that I've done before. But again, another alter. I'll run this, and that's good to go. This one, I'll make sure I'm not highlighting this, otherwise it would run just that. And I'll execute that, and that's now created. So tournament ID and prize ID are the two things are passing in. So we'll paste that here. We have tournament ID, and we have prize ID. We'll actually copy and paste the ID